Welcome to my 1500 subscriber Mega Collaboration. Thank you to all who have supported me by subscribing thus far. I'd also like to thank all the narrators that help keep me going. This is my way to repay them for all of their support and to help listeners find more incredible content to listen to. Links to each of the narrators' channels will be down in the description. If you hear a narrator you like, please feel free to subscribe to them. In this video, there will be true scary stories to start, and then fictional scary stories afterwards. I'll leave a timestamp below to separate the two, in case you just want to skip to the fictional ones. I'd recommend listening to all of them, however, because there is some amazing talent here. Now, without further ado, let's get to the stories. When I was 11, almost 12, the woman living above me was a coke dealer. The night of my 12th birthday, she went missing. Not long after, her boyfriend came down to ask if he could use our phone. This was 2004, so having a cell phone was more of an exception than a rule, at least in my area. For a little context, I was home alone at the time while my mom was at work about a 5-minute walk away. My mom had let our neighbor and her boyfriend come in to use our phone several other times before, so I assumed nothing was wrong with it and let him in, bringing him into the living room, which is towards the front of our apartment, to use the phone in there. He picks up the receiver, dials a number, waits a few seconds, then hangs up the phone. He does this a couple more times before the front door of the building opens. You can easily hear the front door open from where we were. It's a heavy door, the walls are thin, and the way our building is set up, it's a small, old single-family house converted into apartments. Mine and my mom's apartment was the only one on the first floor, and our upstairs neighbor's apartment was the only one above us. Irrelevant, but there was also a much smaller apartment below us. My neighbor's boyfriend looked at me, put his pointer finger to his lips like he was trying to shush me, and told me not to tell anyone he was there before speed walking to my room at the other end of the apartment. I watched my bedroom door close right before there was a loud, hard, cop-like knock on the door. My jaw dropped as I opened the door to see a cop. He asked if my neighbor's boyfriend was there, and being scared, I stammered out, "Yeah, he just went into my room." The officer asked if he could come in, which I agreed to. And as he was coming in, he asked if I could let his partner in the back door and lead them to my room. We walked together to the back of the apartment, and I let his partner in. The back door to the apartment was right next to my bedroom door, but we had to walk around the kitchen table to get there. There was just barely enough space between the two doors to fit a narrow, rectangular table against it without blocking the path to either door. After I let them into my room, I watched as they pulled my neighbor's boyfriend out from my bedroom closet. As they brought him out of my room and towards the back door, which just led to an enclosed fire escape, they told me to go wait in the living room while they brought him out the back door. I walked back to the living room, and after they closed the door, I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I could hear the distinct sound of metal clicking and quickly realized that he had just been handcuffed. Still scared, I waited for the police car to drive away before grabbing my keys, making sure the back door was locked and locking the front door on my way out before running to my mom's work crying. Pretty sure I cut the 5-minute trip into about 2 minutes, and I've never been a fast runner. I was fueled entirely on adrenaline and fear at this point, and I just wanted my mom. When I told her what had happened, my mom was pissed that he had used me the way he had, hiding out in a child's bedroom closet of all places to try to keep the cops from finding him. She gave me a short but gentle lecture that night about not letting people in to use the phone, telling me that I was not to let people to use our phone, even if I knew them, unless she was home. I don't want to know what exactly he was wanted for, nor do I want to know what would have happened if the cops had not shown up. I don't know if he had known the cops were on their way and had come to my apartment specifically to hide from them, or if he was up to something else and knew it was the cops when the front door of the building opened. It was probably only after my close call that my mind really started to run away with what could have happened were it not for my dog. I'm a 26-year-old female. I live with my fiancé, my 2 cats, and my dog Rowan. Our house is literally less than a minute away from a huge farmer's field that is frequented by many dog walkers at all times of the day. Me and my significant other often take turns walking Rowan around the field throughout the day. It was only around 7:30 p.m., and it was still really bright and sunny. Rowan was letting me know it was time to go for a walk, so while my partner was tinkering in the garage, I grabbed his lead and headed to the field. Let me quickly tell you about Rowan. He's a 2-year-old Rottweiler who is very loving and playful, if a little daft, but would not hurt a fly, not a bad bone in his body. He is also extremely well trained. We made sure to put the effort in as he's a big dog breed with a bad rep, so wanted to make a point of not feeding stereotypes. I'm very much of the opinion that there's no bad dogs, just bad owners. Unfortunately, we've had some run-ins with some not-so-good dog owners, so Rowan gets a little nervous when meeting new dogs and people, but we're working on it. Anyway, back to the story. We're walking around the farmer's field. Rowan is off sniffing and peeing on every blade of grass in sight. I always keep an eye out for other walkers anyways, due to Rowan being a little nervous, and I clocked a guy on his own walking down the path towards me fairly far away. At first I thought nothing of it, as plenty of people walk this route without dogs. We were just coming out of lockdown in the UK. As the guy got closer, I noticed he was in a full tracksuit with the hood up, which was odd, as it was like 23 degrees, so shorts and t-shirt weather. He then took a small path off the field. It was a public-made shortcut rather than an official public footpath, but it was well enough used, so I kept walking thinking nothing of it. At about 15 meters away from the path he took, Rowan shot back to my side immediately, dropping the mouthful of dirt he'd been pretending not to eat. I petted him and noticed he was standing super alert, staring at the path entrance. When I looked up, I caught a glimpse of the man peeking around the edge of the bushes that concealed the entrance. I stopped dead in my tracks, and Rowan's fur was stood on end as he positioned himself in front of me. It took me a second to realize that this man had been watching and waiting in the bushes for me to approach. My current route would have meant I'd be walking right by the path's opening. My stomach dropped as I realized we were the only ones around on that field. I had this weird moment where I was almost trying to convince myself that I was overreacting, but then the guy whistled. Not a wolf whistle, but as if to try and get my dog to come to him. Rowan was having none of it though, and I definitely took that as my cue to trust my stranger danger instincts. I immediately turned and sped walked back the way we came, simultaneously pulling my phone out and dialing my partner's number. I ended up having to clip on Rowan's lead to get him to walk with me, and he was not taking his eyes away from the path. He was even growling a little, which was so out of character and put me on edge even more. I glanced back and the man had edged slightly out of the bushes, watching me walk away. My partner answered the phone after a few rings. I was only halfway through stammering out the story, and he was already sprinting up to the field to meet me, telling me to stay on the phone but keep an eye on the man. The man in the tracksuit now fully came out of the bushes and just stood staring at me walking away. I dared a quick look away from him towards the entrance to the field to see my fiancé jogging towards me. He was relieved I was okay, but was also immediately pointing and shouting, "Is that him?" Clearly furious at what this man might have had in mind had Rowan not picked up on him hiding in the bushes. I eventually convinced my fiancé not to confront him as he was still stood staring, almost taunting us. You never know what people might be capable of or have concealed. We came off the field and took Rowan on a different walk, which he was more than happy about. I've never been so proud of Rowan for stepping up and protecting me. Safe to say he got plenty of treats and fussing when we got home.
My parents explore abandoned towns and mines as a hobby. When I was younger, I would get dragged along with them, but when I started college, I stopped going along. However, in those times that I did go with them, I encountered a lot of things that made me very uneasy. Of course, I am and always have been a bit of a skeptic, so I always just assumed that it was the atmosphere getting to me. But there was one time that I legitimately cannot explain what I saw. For context, I live in Arizona, and most of the places we explored were in the northern part of the country. There's quite a few towns that are dying or have already died, and there are plenty of mines that have long since been out of operation. I can't remember where this encounter took place, but I do know my parents wanted to visit after they saw some paranormal investigation show had covered the site of this abandoned mine. My parents aren't exactly paranormal investigators, but they do like visiting and photographing creepy locations. And supposedly haunted locations usually end up having some truly haunting imagery. Getting to this mine was more trouble than any of us expected. The road was so rough that we had to park off on the side of the road and walk a mile or two to even get to the mine. I don't remember if she heard this from someone in the local town or if it was mentioned on the TV show, but apparently, a few years prior, a couple of kids went exploring at the mine and went missing. It was an assumption that the kids probably fell down an open shaft, as they weren't blocked off, and once I got a good look at them myself, they truly did look like bottomless pits. More so than any other creepy place we had visited before, I just felt so uncomfortable in this place. I'm not a particularly violent person, but a voice in the back of my mind kept telling me to push my stepmom down into the mine shaft. After all, she was standing right in front of them with her back turned to me while she was trying to take a picture down it. It would be so easy. No matter how much I tried to shake off the idea, I couldn't help but feel like it was in my best interest to just push her down that mine shaft. Once she stepped away from the bottomless pit, the thoughts went away and I felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I've heard that these kinds of morbid thoughts aren't too uncommon, especially around ledges, but part of me just feels like this was different, even though I can't say I have any proof that it was. It's just that I felt this feeling of overwhelming hatred come over me in those moments that she was standing in front of the shaft, and a few seconds that they were there felt like hours to pass. After she was done taking pictures around the area, she went to go photograph some other areas while my father and I started walking down a path to go see if there was anything of interest on the other side. While we were coming around a bend in the path, we saw someone else. It was a man who looked to be in his mid-20s. He was decked out in full mining gear, and although I am no expert on mining attire, it definitely looked old-fashioned. He gave us a wave and walked off the path toward an empty clearing, where I assumed there were probably more open mine shafts, although I wouldn't know, because it was at that point that my father immediately turned to me and told me that we had to get my stepmother and leave right away. I've tried coming up with explanations for who this man was, but there are a lot of things that just didn't add up. The mine there was not operational, so obviously there shouldn't have been anyone in full mining gear walking around. I considered for a long time that he could have just been someone who wanted to play a practical joke on anyone who went there after seeing the paranormal TV show. However, we saw no vehicles on the way up the rugged road, and we didn't visit this place right after the TV show aired. It was at least 6 months after the show had aired, if not longer. Not to mention, this place wasn't easy to find. We literally had to hunt down locals and ask them for directions because even Google Maps wasn't that helpful in telling us where to go, given that the road leading to the mine was unmarked. It's been 7 years, and I still get the chills whenever I think about it.
I'm writing this on my phone, so apologies if formatting is off. Reading through these posts has made me think about my own experience, and I can't get this one out of my head, which happened to be me, 25-year-old female, around 5 months ago. So I thought, why not share? For a bit of backstory, relevant to why I didn't freak out sooner. I live in a big city which is mostly a friendly place, but like all cities, it has its rough areas. There are 2 main spots that are known to be particularly rough. and for the first 14 years of my life, I lived in one of these areas. So, though it can be naturally a bit uncomfortable, I tend to be pretty unbothered by drunks, addicts, creeps talking to me in the street. Anyway, I moved from one rough area and moved to a safer one, but it's very near to the other. Arguably worse. Rough area. I know both of these areas pretty well too, which helped with what happened 5 months ago. So I had some stuff going on in my personal life, and go through phases of bad anxiety as it is. I had to make the decision to take some time off of work, but wanted to try and stay in a routine, / be productive. What would productive people do? They go to the dentist way past when they should have. So I made an appointment, and when it rolled around, I walked there. My dentist is in a rough area that I now live close to. On my route home, I have to walk past a pub on a main road, which has a super bad reputation. Anything you could think of, it's happened inside, or just outside this pub. Stabbings, shootings, drug raids, the lot. How it's still allowed to run, I have no idea. Anyway, I noticed someone sat on the bench outside the pub. I had my headphones in, but I'd see him saying something. So I assume he's asking me for a lighter or something, and take an earplug out. He asked me if I wanted to join him for a drink. This was around 11:30 a.m., by the way. I just slightly laughed and said no thanks. Now, as soon as I got a few steps away, I had this bad feeling like something was just not right. But as mentioned, I was going through a phase of bad anxiety, so I chalked it up to being just that. After about 2 minutes, I go to turn left, and see the man walking in my direction in the corner of my eye. I told myself it was nothing, but took my headphones out anyway, just in case. As I was about to walk through the narrow road that leads to the car park, and is always very empty, all of a sudden I hear him shouting at me, "Hey miss, I'm talking to you. Wait." The usual stuff. He catches up to me and tells me, "I'm not a creep, but you're too beautiful to let go." I try and stay polite, but also make it clear I'm not interested. I have no idea why, but seem to have lost my ability to lie. So when he asked if I was single, I said yes. When he asked what I was doing that night, a Friday, I said I had no plans. I went 100% no, I should have lied. And as the truth came out, I was really annoyed with myself, but hey ho. He seems to get the message, and I say I really have to go, so carry on walking, thinking that's the end of it. So I make my way across the big car park. Also worth noting here that I can only go 2 ways, where I'm heading back the way I came. At the end of the car park is a cycle/pedestrian lane that has a massive wall on the other side with 2 lots of steps that lead to the car park to the retail park, and bushes on the other side, and is super narrow. Sorry if that's confusing, it's hard to explain. I get into the lane and I hear footsteps like someone is running. Probably a jogger. I'm being paranoid, until right behind me I hear, "At least give me your number." I finally start to panic and realize actually it's not my anxiety. This is shady as fuck. I give him a number, but change the last digit, and this guy proceeds to attempt to drop call me. Clearly my phone doesn't ring, and then he starts getting annoyed, saying I need to give him the right number. I apologize. He then has his hand basically on my phone, stood way too close to me, and orders me to type his number in and drop call him. Awesome. Creep now has my phone number. Still enough for him, I reiterate that I'm on my way somewhere and seriously need to get going. What happened next is honestly a blur, and I must have had a massive adrenaline rush. He said something, but I can't remember what. I think I sort of blacked out. And then he grabbed me by my elbow. Next thing I knew, I was at the top of one of the sets of steps that led to a much bushier and open space. I had obviously panicked. He yanked my arm free and legged it. Pretty impressive how fast I got up those steps considering I hadn't been to the gym in months. Luckily one of my friends works in one of the stores in the retail park, So I walked over there, and practically looking over my shoulder the whole time, I find my friend, visibly shaking, can barely speak. She asks if I'm okay, and I just burst into tears. I gather my thoughts and say what just happened. I try to downplay it, saying I'm just being dramatic, etc. He's been calling my phone this whole time. She takes my phone and notes his number, then blocks him. She takes me to the staff room and convinces me to file a police report, which I do. Unfortunately, though, I found out street harassment is not actually illegal where I live. But because he made physical contact, it might not be a complete lost cause. Please tell me they will be in touch. Now, fast forward until around 2 weeks ago. My mom's friend who knew about what had happened sent her an article and asked her to show me. I genuinely couldn't believe my eyes. It was the man who followed a girl and then assaulted her in the same rough area. At the end of the article is a picture. It's him. I haven't heard anything from the police, and since he had already been charged, I figured there wasn't any need for me to contact them again. I wish they would have taken what I said more seriously, though. As I specifically remember, my friend saying someone younger or less used to that behavior might not have run or got away, which was what convinced me to file the report in the first place. My heart goes out to the girl, and although currently in jail, I really hope neither of us ever have to face him again. His charge was pretty serious, so he will be there for a long time, thankfully. This happened to me, currently 20 and female, sometime during 2012. The backstory. My mother began dating a guy from Melbourne, and we lived in South Australia. We'll call the partner Jeff, and my username will be shortened to HRD. Jeff invited Mom and I both to come over to Melbourne for a week or two. Details are fuzzy, so apologies there. But I distinctly remember getting off at the airport and Jeff walking us through a very small, cluttered airport. Now, we have to get onto a bus to get to a station and then catch another bus to his place, despite Mom's back and hip problems. Now, the meaty bits. Being a 12-year-old, cool girl, I don't want to sit with my mom and her partner. When I realize it's a bendy bus, I choose the seat just before the little platform that turns. For context, there is one seat behind me that fits 2 people. Mine could only fit 1, and there's a girl across to my right. I'm facing the back of the bus, and so I have to crane my neck to see them both. I happen to look down the aisle towards my mom. Instead of watching the buildings go by, I catch this random guy's eye. He smiles, and being the polite little thing, I smile back. He was pretty scruffy. Stubble, yellow crooked teeth, and shabby clothes. Classic bogan. Australian trailer trash. After a while, the bus makes the first handful of what feels like 1,000 stops, and he takes a seat right behind me. There were barely any left, and now he had nowhere else to sit but with me. That sent all my stranger danger alarms sounding, but I was calm about it. Maybe he wanted to chat. He starts talking to me about school. That's fine. What grade I'm in. Now he definitely knows I'm a minor. When he asks me where I'm from, where I'm going, and who with, not okay. So I say I'd rather not say, mister. I also remember him commenting that I was cute and dressed well, so considered little HRD substantially freaked out. I kept looking at the girl to my right and began formulating a plan to pretend she was an old friend who moved schools. All this time I'm glancing at her, and I can see the creep fogging up the glass and looking at me when I look at him through the windows. Son of a gun even waved. I thought about turning my head to wink and give us both random names. This trip took so long. Like, hey, Miranda, I'm Jenny, remember me? And then I turned my head so he wouldn't see and wink with the eye furthest from him, so she'd know I needed help. She was alone and definitely older than me, so I was waiting for the right time. Then this bastard sniffs me, leans forward in his seat and slowly tilts himself back, like I'm a grade A Coke. I sat there for maybe another 30 minutes before I finally mustered up the courage to leave my seat. That blessed angel across from me almost looked relieved as I moved my bags up to the front of the bus with my mom. I go with them. I tell her about the chronic sniffer and the way he was talking to me. So Jeff phone heads to the interchange. Again, another angle in the situation. And he isn't just stopped from getting on another bus. He was being questioned by the police. 3 or 4 officers in full uniform have him in cuffs, and he's shouting at them, saying he didn't do anything wrong. An officer asked me what happened, and I told him. He was asking me lots of personal questions. Staring, he sniffed me a few times, and he moved seats to get closer to me. Then got himself gridlocked. We couldn't press charges, but I was scared to get on a damn bus again after that. I had to though, because Melbourne is a car or bus train kind of state. He was taken away for being intoxicated on public transport. Chronic sniffer, let's not meet again. The following experience happened to me a few years ago, when I was on a train getting home from school. It was around 10 p.m. at night, as I had stayed late to study in the public library. One thing you should know is that my train line is particularly dodgy, and you can meet some truly weird people on the train when it's late. When I got into my carriage that night, I noticed it was particularly empty, apart from 3 women sitting on the opposite end of the carriage. I sat down and plugged my earphones in to watch YouTube. My train ride usually takes around 45 minutes, with about 3 stops into the train ride. The only other person who had gone onto my carriage at the time was a man who was wearing construction clothes. He sat near the 3 women, so I assumed he knew them. I turned my attention back to my video. A few minutes later, I noticed that the 3 women who were sitting on the opposite side of the carriage had moved to my side. I didn't really think much of it as I was engrossed in my video. I was watching. That's when I noticed someone had taken a seat opposite of me. It was the man who'd gone on earlier. He asked me my name, but was giving me weird vibes, so I pretended like I couldn't hear him. I had my earphones in after all. He then proceeded to tap my knee to gain my attention. There was no ignoring him. So I removed my earphones and looked at him. He was a big guy, probably around his early 40s, and he was clean shaven. He asked me my name, to which I gave him a fake name. He then asked how old I was. I was in my school uniform at the time, so I told him. He reached out his hand and introduced himself. Not wanting to be rude, I extended my own hand to his. This is when things started to get strange. His handshake was super weird. His grip was abnormally tight, and he seemed to pull my hand towards him as he shook it. I quickly withdrew my hand. He then asked me if I had a girlfriend, as he thought I was quite attractive. Alarm bells began to ring in my head, and glanced over at the other 3 women who refused to even look over my direction. Seeing as they would be no help, I would just have to look out for myself. He then took out his phone and started showing me pictures of a girl who seemed to look around my age. He then asked if I thought she was beautiful. Again, not wanting to be rude, I simply nodded and said that she was. He then asked me if I would be interested in marrying her. I just started laughing as I thought he was joking around, but his eyes were dead serious, and he just glared at me. He repeated his question, to which I responded that I did not know her, and that it was inappropriate. He suggested that I give him my number, so that he could arrange for us to meet. This man was seriously creeping me out. I politely declined, stating that I was busy with school, and that I wasn't looking to get into a relationship. As I said this, the train was coming to a halt at the next station. I was still 3 stops away from my station, but I decided it was time for me to get out of this situation. I apologized, explaining that this was my stop, and that it was nice to meet him. As I got up to leave, he extended his hand for a handshake, and thanked me for talking to him. I did not want to shake his hand again, but I didn't want to trigger him, so I reached my hand out. Suddenly he grabbed my hand and pulled me towards him. His eyes were full of anger. He then asked, "Why don't you want to fuck my daughter? I will break you." I quickly broke the grip and left the carriage. As it was nighttime, there was always police officers patrolling the platforms. I reached towards one of the officers and told him everything that had happened. I then described his clothing and which carriage I was sitting on. while waiting for the next train. The same officer came up to me and told me that officers had picked him up 2 stations down and thanked me for letting him know. Although the officer asked me for my details, I was never notified as to what happened to him. One thing I know for sure is, creepy guy on the train. Creepy guy on the train, I definitely never want to meet you again. This was over a year ago, so I'm safe now. I had broken up with my now ex in January of 2019. My doing. I was angry at everything and had joined Tinder. Talked to a guy that seemed pretty cool and was quite attractive. I talked to him quite a bit, took a lift down to where he lived. Now, his dad had passed away not too long ago, so he moved back in with his mom to help out. I found that very sweet, and so I thought nothing of it. We took a lift to Walmart and to the liquor store, as his mom had requested some wine. I had brought a pizza to bake at their home to make a decent impression, and had purchased her wine, which she gave me cash for despite my protest. Anything trying to make a good impression. This home was gorgeous. They had an old-timey jukebox, and their freaking sink tap in the bathroom were installed in the mirrors. Water flowed from a spout in their freaking mirrors. His mom was as sweet as Southern tea, and seemed to have taken a liking to me. Cool. So, this guy has been messaging his lesbian best friend, C, and explained that he had helped her out after she broke her ankle and such. Again, I thought, what a nice guy. We drank, we had sex, everything was cool. I told him I had borderline before we met up, and warned him I had scars from previous cutting incidents, but nothing recent. He was fine with it and understood. The next morning, I had an interview at a major company call center, and my mom offered to drive me. Such a sweetheart. I did great in the interview and was offered the job. I immediately texted the guy to tell him the good news. So one day when I was home, I had slept for about 8 hours. I woke up to a dozen text messages and over 20 Facebook messages from him. It ranged from, "Hey, how's it going?" to, "Fuck, it's hard to say this." I had seen how the messages progressed as I quickly scrolled through, and saw the one that says, "I have a picture of it still. Those cut marks on your arm, yeah." I wouldn't have dated a cutter anyway. Most of them are fucking pathetic, that need to get some serious fucking help. Might as well keep doing that since it seems to be your only friend. What the actual fuck? I blocked him. Then I posted it to my Facebook page so anyone knew him could see what he was actually up to. I get a friend request from his lesbian best friend, C. She filled me in. She is not a lesbian. She had just broken up with him hours before befriending me. So they were still dating when he had me over. And he told her I was a lesbian. Also that he goes by his middle name. I had done a basic search with the name he provided on his Facebook page to make sure he wasn't a felon or some shit before meeting him. Well, when I did the search with his real first name, sure as shit, so many charges including child P. He had been stalking her, pinging her phone location and messaging her shit like, "Oh, what, you're not gonna leave your house?" And he told her to kill herself. She had gotten the cops involved and she had sent me screenshots of the messages he was sending. We talked a bit more, and while I'm not a medical professional, it was clear something was wrong. He was lying, manipulative, aggressive, angry, and obsessive. His moods would flip faster than mine. I offered to send her what I could of a message in case she could use them to build a case against him. Shortly after, I get a friend request from a name I don't recognize, something generic like Mike. Then I get a message, "Hey, it's Jay. How's it going? How's your job at," insert big company name I have been hired at, that his mom drove me to interview at. I was freaking out. He knew where I worked. The building was secure, but the parking lot not so much. I got pepper spray and called my dad, who has been in the police force and such since before I was alive. He advised to not carry a baseball bat because if it was wrestled from me, it could be used against me, but pepper spray was a decent choice. He also said that while online bullying isn't something the police can do much about, If he messages me again, it goes into harassment area, and it needed to be reported ASAP. I was getting off work after midnight, and was scared shitless. I parked as close to the building as possible, pepper spray in hand. Fortunately, I haven't ran into him since. I do not want to meet him again. I've also moved since and changed jobs. If it sounds too good to be true, it really fucking is.
I was recounting some old daycare stories to a friend, which jogged my memory on this incident, so I decided to share it. I used to be a preschool teacher. At the daycare I taught at, in the mornings until around 3 p.m., I worked with the babies, and then once the elementary school kids arrived, I worked with them. This took place a few months ago. The daycare I worked at had a basketball court at the base of a hill, and it was situated next to a major road. I had taken our 5th graders down to the basketball court and all was fine. I'm monitoring the kids and occasionally glancing at the road because although we were separated by 2 different fences, a dedicated individual could climb over both, and although the daycare was located in a wealthy area, we did occasionally have some homeless addicts wander into the parking lot. You never know what those kind of people could do. I got distracted trying to defuse an argument that had broken out between a few of my boys, when a few kids ran to the fence and were waving frantically and calling greetings, and so I turned to look, assuming they saw some other teacher leave. Instead, I saw an unfamiliar grey car with the hazard lights flashing. The passenger window was rolled down and a red-headed woman was leaning over from the driver's side and waving at my kids. I shooed all the kids away, not liking the feeling I got. They all assured me they knew who she was, an old teacher, but from what I had heard about previous employees, I didn't recognize her, and I had only been there for around a year or so. The woman made eye contact with me for a minute, and her smile just dropped. She didn't look threatening, but she looked remarkably unhappy. After what felt like a lifetime but could only have been a few seconds of her staring at me, she drove off. It felt very bizarre, and so I called for one of the admin over the walkie-talkies we had. My supervisor and the assistant director came a few moments later, and I explained what had happened, and they called over one of the boys who had greeted the lady. He again explained she was an old teacher who used to work there, and that she drove by and frequently stopped on the road to say hello. The director asked him to describe her, and he did, and she frowned and said she'd check the cameras. Later, after closing, the assistant director told me that there had never been an employee there matching that description, and that she didn't recognize the car on the cameras. She couldn't catch the plates of the car, so we didn't have much information to give the police. Not to be dramatic, but this story freaks me out, because this woman had come by the daycare enough that the kids recognized her and had talked to her. It's also unsettling where her car was positioned on the road. We have plenty of cameras filming the entire property, and many of them cuts the road, and she was parked just so that none of the cameras could catch her license plate. It felt very deliberate, because you have to try to avoid our cameras that much. Just for clarification on a few things, yes, we did notify the police, but we never heard back from them on the matter. According to a few friends of mine, the woman hasn't been seen since November, when this happened, which was again reported. We absolutely didn't ignore this incident, promise. I have since stopped working at this daycare, but still, lady who visits the daycare, let's not meet again.
This is my brother's girlfriend's story. She doesn't have a Reddit, but I told her about this subreddit and she wanted to share her story because it's creepy, but also because you can learn from it. I go to school in a big city that is one of the least safe cities in the United States. I chose this school for nursing and definitely not for the location. I live in a row house off campus with 3 other girls, cheaper and nicer than dorms, or so we thought. I guess you get what you pay for. We are all girls and sophomores in college. As you would guess, we go out for drinks, come back to things that we don't remember. We just started our rent in August, 3 floors, plus a basement, which was padlocked by the owner. Understandable, we would definitely have parties down there to avoid immediate cleanup. The house was great. Amazing location to school and work. I am a CNA who works odd hours, which will be important later. It was not expensive and in good condition. I had never lived with this many people before, just one roommate, so before we would definitely know if someone had misplaced or changed something. I started to notice that my snacks would either be half gone or completely gone. I was getting annoyed, but in a house of many people, it was too much work to try to figure out who ate it, so I just ignored it. Slowly, as girls do, we started making comments about someone eating our food, but in a passive-aggressive way. We all just let it go, cause who wants a whole house fight? I worked until about 11 o'clock in the NICU, and get home about 11:30, mostly on weeknights. I started to notice pants left out or snack wrappers around. I thought it was odd because none of my roommates had done this before, but I just think, oh, they probably drank a bottle of wine and went to bed and forgot about this. Again, my roommates started making comments. This time, we started asking because it was getting annoying that all our food being gone and things being left out. I knew it was one of them, but who wants to admit that they ate someone else's snack when in college snacks are in high commodity? We chalked it up to the girl who always smokes and eats her weight in food, but she swore it wasn't her. This went on for about 2 months. It got more obvious someone was clearly taking everyone's food, definitely the girl who always smokes. I see her as being someone that would eat the whole snack pantry at night. I wish it was her. One night at work, I was about to get off, but a situation happened and I didn't end up leaving until 12:30. I took the bus home. I carry pepper spray, a taser, and a pocket knife, don't worry. I got home and was about to collapse. I wanted to go to bed as soon as possible. I walk in the front door and the stairs are directly in front of you. You can also see down the side into the kitchen. I walk in and saw someone in the kitchen, but I was too tired to say hi, thinking I could end up in a 30-minute conversation about nothing, so I went straight upstairs. When I got up to the second floor, I noticed that all my roommates' doors were closed, which always meant that they were in their rooms for the night, or asleep. I got a weird feeling, just something that made it click. They were all asleep, right? I text our house group chat, asking if anyone was in the kitchen. I felt stupid for even asking. 2 responded no, and said the other 2 had been asleep. I knew it wasn't any of my roommates down there at that moment. I dialed 911, but didn't press call. I crept into my roommate's room, access hall. Thankfully, or maybe not thankfully, she didn't have her door locked. I whispered, telling her that someone was in the house. She gave me the widest eyes ever, and almost looked like she was about to cry. She didn't suspect anything like I had, but for reference, we live in a very bad area, as there was a shooting in the house 2 doors down only weeks earlier by an intruder. She mouthed to make a call. The whole time we were dead silent. We didn't really hear anything at all. I was starting to think I was seeing things after such a long day and regretted that I dialed, thinking I was going to look like an idiot when they showed up and I was just overtired and dreaming. We explained to the operator what was going on, and they said that they would send someone as soon as possible. That actually doesn't mean right away, since it's a big and dangerous city. The police showed up, and I didn't even want to go downstairs, but the operator confirmed that it was them, so I did. But the whole time, I could swear that the operator could hear my heart beating. The police came in and looked around. I'm thinking, oh god, I look so dumb. They asked if there was any other floors. We tell them technically the basement, but it's padlocked, so really no. They checked the basement just in case, and yeah, they were right. The man had been living in the padlocked basement. The lock was pulled off its hinges and just kind of propped against the wall. We never looked back there and rarely went out back. The guy had taken a comforter of one of my roommates out of the hall, had a mattress from God knows where, and his clothes. Well, he was the one moving and eating all of our stuff. He would come out in the middle of the night and do it. He started getting more comfortable. I don't know if he was drugged out or forgot to clean his tracks, or if he didn't really care. My roommates and I have pretty consistent schedules during the week, probably letting him think that any time after 12 was good to come out. We never slept with our individual doors locked, and that freaks me out the most. He had access to any one of us at any moment, and we had no idea. When he was getting arrested, I was the only one to go down and look. I don't really know why, and I wish I didn't. I took a picture in the process of him being arrested to show my roommates who were too afraid to go down, and this is him. So yeah, let's never actually meet, dude.
I went to college in New Orleans a couple years before Hurricane Katrina. I was a senior when it hit. During my first year, I had no car, so I had to take the bus everywhere. One afternoon, I went shopping in a not-so-great part of town, New Orleans East. Not particularly bad, but kind of poor and a little seedy. Even though I was a young woman walking around the city alone, I never really felt unsafe. Well, that was about to change. I had a couple of shopping bags and was waiting at the bus stop, ready to go back to my dorm. At this time of day, this was fairly desolate stretch of road. There were 2 buses that passed by the stop, but one every hour at the most. I had a bit of a wait ahead of me. The stop was near a levee, dirt embankment, meant to keep the water from the lake or river out of the city, the things that broke when Katrina hit. Behind the levee were only train tracks and water. Pretty much I was standing on a deserted road in a crummy part of town with nothing but water, pavement, and railroad tracks. I felt okay though. I had my cell phone. It was still light out, and the bus would be along eventually. I waited, and waited, and waited. No bus. Then I heard a voice behind me. I turned and saw a boy coming over the levee and walking towards me. He was about 10, so I wasn't really leery of him, as I would have been of a grown man. I was a good foot taller, at least. I didn't know where he had came from, as there weren't any houses anywhere near the direction he'd come from. Railroad tracks and a big lake were all that were there. He wasn't waiting on the bus. He came up to me and started asking what was in the bags, and if I'd show him. Typical kid, I guess. Kind of strange, but not too creepy. I tried to brush him off and ignore him. It didn't work. He started grabbing for the bags and being more insistent that I give him something. I didn't have anything that would interest a kid, just some clothes and groceries. He refused to leave though. Then it got creepy. He started to grab at me, not the bags. He started rubbing his hips against my leg and trying to hug me or dry hump me. I was thoroughly grossed out and tried to walk away. He walked with me and tried to jump up and kiss me. Ugh. I mean, he was a kid. This was a way too sexual behavior. For a kid. Too sexual for anyone at a bus stop. I looked around for anyone who could help, but there wasn't anyone. I could have walked back to the stores, but then I'd missed the bus. I decided to just walk down the road to the next stop, hoping the kid would go back home or wherever it was he came from. That's when he decided to grab me again by the arm and try to pull me up to the levee. Oh no, I pushed him off me, loath to touch him. He was sticky, as kids tend to be, and sweaty, plus he's a creeper, but still a kid. I was a little bigger than he was, and I didn't want to hurt him. He told me that I should come to his house, which was apparently on the other side of the levee, as he pointed. I don't think so. No one builds a house on the water side of a levee. Levees are built to keep water away from the houses. You couldn't possibly live on the other side of it. I wasn't going anywhere with this kid, so I kept walking. He followed me, still insisting that I come to his house. He said no one was home, and there was a bed, and we could have sex. What? I was 19 at the time, and he looked to be about 10. Luckily, my boyfriend called my cell phone, and the kid seemed to take that a little more seriously than my method of shoving and yelling at him. Good, because I was about ready to hurt him just to get away. I stayed on the phone with my boyfriend and told him what the kid was doing. I don't know why it never occurred to me to call the cops. I guess because it's New Orleans, and cops don't show up too quickly, unless it's a quarter. The kid ran up to the levee, back where he'd came from, and disappeared. I walked down to the next bus stop, maybe about 1/4 mile from the original stop, as I waited, praying a bus would come soon. I heard rocks hitting the pavement. I turned and saw the kid crouching on the levee, throwing rocks at me. I had been annoyed and creeped out before, but this was starting to actually get dangerous. They were good-sized rocks and sharp. A few minutes later, the bus came, and I got on it. It wasn't the right one, but I didn't care at this point. I took a ride to the casino, about 1 mile or 2 down the road, where the driver let me get a transfer to the right bus. I made it back to my dorm room and never went back to that part of town alone again. I kind of wonder what the deal was though. I don't know if the kid had issues or what would have happened if I had gone with him to his house on the other side of the levee. For all I knew, there could have been a group of guys back there using the kid to lure me out of sight so they could do God knows what to me.
This happened to me during December of last year. At the time, I started working a new job in the mall and had to work for most of Boxing Day. I was usually done work at around 10 p.m., but transit seemed to have ended at 7 p.m. during this day. I'm a student who didn't go home for the holidays due to the job, and never had to deal with holiday transit hours. I decided to call an Uber driver, and the driver picked me up right in front of the mall. We had a casual conversation during the drive back, and he learned about where I worked and how I'm living on my own for the time being, since my roommates were out of town for the holidays. Fast forward to the next day at work. Around 6 p.m., this driver walks into the store and tries to strike a conversation with me. I told him I had to get back to work, but he continued to ask me if we could hang out later, to which I said no, and finally, he decided to leave. At the end of that shift, around 10 p.m., I walked out of the store, planning to take the bus home. As soon as I stepped out of the store, the same driver immediately pulled up next to me and offered to give me a ride back home. After going back and forth with me declining and him saying it was a free ride, I decided to walk away and caught a bus home. I was pretty overwhelmed by the fact that he showed up to my workplace and waited 3 hours until I was done work to offer me a ride home. I was pretty overwhelmed by the fact that he showed up to my workplace and waited 3 hours until I was done work to offer me a ride home. I've since reported this to Uber, and they've notified me that they've suspended this driver, providing me with a full refund and gave me a link to provide to the police if I plan on filing a report. It was silly of me to give away private information like that to a stranger, but I hope I never meet this driver again, who appeared twice my age, knows where I work and live. Lesson learned. So, creepy Uber driver, let's not meet again. I was 20 years old. I had left home when I was 16 years old and decided to explore the world and see what I could find. I've been in Texas and Louisiana most of my life. I went to Missouri, to New York, California, anywhere in the United States I could have decided to go. Finally, I decided to go home. Well, up until then, I had been staying in Oklahoma when I received a phone call from my mom saying she might be dying from cancer. I came to find out later that she actually wasn't. She just wanted me home. I was hitchhiking through Oklahoma and was near Chickasaw National Park. In 2 days, I hadn't been able to catch a ride, sticking out my thumb doing all that, and nobody stopped. So I said oh well, and pitched a tent in the national park. I decided to explore some, and I followed the paved road until I got to the camping area. There was a fire pit off a little ways from the road, and it was a clear area. There were picnic tables, so I decided that's where I was going to camp for the night. I decided to explore a little bit, and followed a deer trail into the woods. As I was walking, I looked to my left on the ground, and there was a hawk laying there, with no head, as if it had been burned off. An eerie feeling came over me, but I just brushed it off as me being paranoid. I already had some paranormal experiences, but never came across one where it involved animals, so I walked away and went back into the area that I had decided to pitch my tent for the night. I sat there until it started getting dark and began to set my tent up. I left the tent flap open because it was a very cool afternoon. Finally, night came. The street lamps that were all along the paved road came on. The lights were actually good enough where I could actually read a book. At that time, I was reading Anne Rice, Queen of the Damned. As the time went on, I started to get sleepy. I reached up to zip up my tent flap and looked over at the street light that was directly in front of my tent. Standing there directly under the street light was a creature as tall as the street light itself. Well, maybe not as tall, but perhaps a couple inches directly underneath it. Its hair was very, very long, and it looked a little hunched. I couldn't see its eyes, because the hair seemed to be there in front of its face. It was all in black, as far as I could tell, but what little skin seemed to stick out was as white as chalk, and the little bit of skin I could see was its hands, which clearly went past its knees. The hands were just hanging there. Its nails were black, very black, so black it seemed to absorb the light. It just stood there, and it seemed as if the air surrounding it was vibrating. It seemed as if there was a type of static in the air. Now, don't get me wrong, I was very startled and afraid. I didn't know what this was. Then suddenly, underneath the hair, I could see white starting to show, and it was as if the creature was smiling at me. It stood there for a very long time. Finally, as I was looking at it, something came over me. Now, you may not believe me. You might say that the story isn't true. But I know that it happened. I know that it happened to me. I grew angry. Very angry. I felt a rage inside me, and it grew very strong. I stared the creature down. I got out of my tent, stood up, and I looked straight at it and said, "I am not afraid of you. You have no power over me." It seemed to make the creature laugh, and all that did was make me even more angry. I stood my ground again and told it, "I am not afraid of you. You have no power over me." I stood there, staring at it for what seemed like the longest time, white-hot rage growing inside me. When all of a sudden, I heard a loud snap behind me. I quickly turned around to find out what the noise was. There was nothing there. And then a thought suddenly occurred. That thing's probably behind me now. I turned around quickly again and looked towards the streetlight, and it was no longer there. I bundled up my sleeping bag after it disappeared. That night, as I slept, I had a horrible nightmare of the creature standing over me, laughing with a toothy grin. The next morning, I packed up my stuff and looked towards the streetlight where that thing had been standing. There was blood on the street lamp pole. I no longer had that anger that I had felt. I was very much afraid. So I gathered up all my stuff and got out of there as quickly as I could. I headed down the highway, stuck out my thumb, and thankfully, someone picked me up. I have never been back to Chickasaw Park since that night. I never plan on going back there ever again. A word of warning. Be careful where you camp. You never know what you might come across. You might not believe what I have written, but it did happen. And it happened to me.
Alright, I'd like to start off. I'm not religious. I used to be. I studied many religions and theology for some time, but I don't subscribe to anyone. So, when it comes to dark spirits and all that stuff, I really don't believe in it. And that being said, when I was a kid on the highway with my grandma, I lived in Hawaii, and we were driving on the Pali Highway. My grandma was driving, and her headlights were on pretty high because it was dark. On the right side of the road, I saw a shadow person pass by it. No chance that it was a person, an actual person, because I could make out the features of the grass and plants around it. The second time, I was getting some snacks when I was a teenager. I was at the fridge, and to the left of my fridge was a hallway and a set of stairs. I closed the fridge, turned left, saw a shadow-like thing, darker than the dark of night. It was the nighttime when this happened, and the rest of the room looked brighter than the being itself. Even in complete darkness, it's like 2 a.m., the shadow thing basically flew up the stairs. And an interesting thing to note, there was no sound. It kind of makes your senses confused because you're not used to seeing things that move that quickly, but make no sound as well. It flew up the stairs and flew right through me. Although I didn't feel anything, and I wouldn't say my life has been unlucky or unfortunate, or that my life is bad in any way since then. So, I'm not cursed or possessed or whatever. It just went through me like I wasn't even there. Also, a side note, when I saw the being this time, when I looked at it, I got the feeling of seeing something like a tornado or some sort of natural powerful thing. I wasn't scared, but more respectful, I suppose. Just a feeling of a strange one. Whenever I thought about seeing a ghost or something, I always thought I'd be freaked out. But no, not this time. Alright, so since it's still pretty clear in my memory, even being in my mid-20s, and this stuff all happened while I was below 18, I figured I would write a description of what I saw as best as I can. So a shadow person, it looks very, very black, like zero light will reflect off of it. If you look up Vantablack, which is one of the blackest materials ever created by man, it comes close to it. However, I've seen videos of people shining light on Vantablack, and at a certain point, it just looks white. So it's not quite the same. Imagine if Vantablack stayed the pure black. Imagine the purest void that no light can enter or reflect off of. Now, take that and put that into human form, with a feathery, fuzzy, hazy outline just on the rim of it. This will give it an appearance of a hazy look that resembles a shadow, but firm enough of a border to make sure you know it's not a shadow. Like the human shape is leaking into this world. Now the thing is, from my fridge experience, this form can take a lot of shapes. So basically, in my own experience, shadow people are sort of shape-shifty as well. When they move, they don't animate. They just float along in a direction. So basically, blacker than the blackest black you could ever think of, almost like a void, and to the point where you almost can't believe you're seeing it. So in my experience, it was silent, it was fast moving, but when moving, it had no animation when moving along. The weird thing is, after all this happened, I haven't really had an experience with shadow people again. As an adult, I haven't seen anything like that since. I have had experiences with ghosts since then. Restaurants are pretty much always haunted, and I'm a chef, but no shadow people. The previous story you just heard reminded me of a similar situation. This was my mother's experience years ago. I will try to be as descriptive as I can, to the best of my memory. Backstory on the healer, who we will call Ellie. My mom noticed a woman staring at her in the bookstore while browsing codependent books. After about the 5th time, my mom looked up and she was still staring. She was about to tell her, "What are you looking at, lady?" when Ellie told her that's not what she needed. They stayed and talked in the cafe for a while, and my mom got a healing from Ellie. It made her feel so much better, and she decided to introduce us. I got a healing as well, and she helped my mother and I with some insight on some paranormal experiences we have had for a little while. My mom said she was lying in bed with her earplugs in, as she always does because of the dogs and my dad getting home at midnight from work. Both her and my dad were in bed, with my dad asleep for most of this. Despite having her earplugs in, she awoke to what sounded like plastic bags rustling. They do reuse them, but the only one would be for her trash can. She was trying to wake up a little more and figure out what was going on. The dog was in his usual spot, taking up the bed, and the cats for some reason never really tended to go crazy at night. This is when she sees them. To lay out their room, it's pretty square, just roomy enough, and a mint green color. If you are laying in their queen-size bed, you have it so the door is on your left, bedside tables on each side, and my mom sleeps on the right, which has a window. The wall across from the bed has my dad's dresser, and in the corner by the window is my mom's. Not really a cramped setup. She was looking at the portion of the wall in the right between her dresser and the window, blinds closed, and when she did, she sees 2 large sets of legs, basically like the size of 2 very tall men. The ceilings now, in the house, are about 10 to 12 feet high, and so my mom's eyes follow their legs and the rest of their bodies all the way up to the wall, to where it's like they were too tall for the room and are looking down on her. She also said there was no distinctive shape to them, just a silhouette. Now, my mom said despite them both having red eyes, she didn't feel scared or have a negative feeling. She also said there really wasn't a positive one either. She didn't feel puzzled. From how I can describe it, she was just frozen for a good minute, not knowing what they are. Just that they were there, and that was that. She woke my dad and told him the best that she could at what was going on, but of course when they both looked, they were gone. Now, my father is not a hardcore believer, kind of on the skeptic side, but he does listen to Coast to Coast AM and stuff like that. He was freaked out though. He grabbed his mag light, which he keeps next to his bed, and shined it on everything, but he didn't see a thing. He actually used that flashlight to check things out for quite a while after that, but he'll never admit it. So, now on to my opinion, the more interesting part. My mother talks to Ellie about it. Ellie meditates on it and gets back to her explaining that they were not negative. They were actually more of protectors, popping in on her for whatever damn middle of the night creepy reason, and there was no need to worry. My mother had also received her brother's ashes months before, and was seeing blue orbs a lot around the encasement since Ellie. She had to move them from her dresser and into the living room after all of this. She didn't feel like it was right to have the ashes separated since some of them were in the living room. After all this, all incidents ceased. Any thoughts about this are absolutely welcome.
Back when I was a child, my parents would take my little brother and I to my grandparents' house, typically for a couple weeks at a time during summer vacation. This made their lives easier, as they didn't have to worry about childcare, and we got to visit Grandma and Grandpa. Win-win situation, really. My grandma and grandpa had a decent-sized house on a large piece of land that was, essentially, in the middle of nowhere. I would say that their house was about as backwoods as you could get, and their property line went straight against what I remember as a very large forest. The layout was basically their house, the yard, and a small pond, and then a densely collected area of woods. Back when we would go outside to play, we were told to stay in the yard and not go too far into the wooded area. Pretty standard instructions for kids our age, and much like all kids our age, we would push the envelope each time. We would always go further and further into the wooded area, completely ignorant to the possible dangers that were lurking out there. One day when I was about 12, I believe, and my brother was 10, we went out to play as usual, but decided we were going to go to a spot that we'd never been through. We grabbed our basic tools, which were nothing more than a compass and a pocket knife, and we set out into the woods early in the morning, around 7:30. It was a pretty normal exit. We said we were going to go outside. My grandma said stay close to the house and not go deep into the woods. We said we wouldn't, and then immediately opted to break that promise. It went pretty normal at first. We went out into the woods and made our way behind the house and past the pond. We got to the line of trees and just kind of stood there for a moment, me trying to figure out which way I wanted to go, and my brother waiting for my lead. I decided that we would head to the left, and wanted to keep going until we could no longer see the house. At the time, this sounded like a great idea, but looking back, I realized how easily we could have gotten lost, and at a time when cell phones weren't really a thing, it could have gone really bad. So we started off into the woods, heading straight west according to the compass. We hiked for a while, finding all the normal things, mushrooms, birds, interesting rocks, and the like. After a while, we got to an area where we were sure we hadn't seen before, based entirely on a large rock that was in the middle of the clearing. We get to the rock, and my brother sits on it, and then asks if we should start heading back. Me, being the adventurist I was at the time, said that I wanted to keep going. As I looked around, I tried to take in the area and figure out where exactly we could go, when I noticed that there was a bit of a ravine down a little bit further in. I told my brother that I wanted to go check it out, but he started to complain about his legs being tired. I'm pretty sure he was just scared about being in the woods and getting in trouble. I rolled my eyes and told him that if he was in so much pain, he should go back to the house without me. I could tell that this did the trick. The look on his face was one of fear. He knew that he would likely get lost if he went alone, and he was already scared as it was. Honestly, again, thinking back on this, I was kind of a jerk to him, and, well, I really shouldn't have been. So he asked me if he could just stay on the rock and wait for me to come back up. I rolled my eyes and said yes, and that I wouldn't take too long. I walked over to the ravine and noticed that it was actually a small creek, something I wasn't even aware existed on my grandparents' property. I told my brother that I was going to climb down and that he needed to stay put. He nodded, and I turned back to start climbing down the short cliff. I get about halfway down, and I hear what sounds like a branch of a tree snapping. At first, I thought it was nothing, but that's when I looked a bit further down the small stream. Down in the ravine, about 100 feet or so down the way, I saw what I initially thought was a small bear. As I watched it, I noticed that it wasn't a bear at all. This horrifying creature had the face like a wolf. Its head was covered in a thick black fur that was matted and mangy. It had long arms like a full-grown man, and it had long claws that it was using to cut into what I believe was a deer carcass. I sat there frozen for a few moments, just watching this thing rip the dead animal to shreds, its snout and mouth covered in blood. After a few seconds of feeling like I was about to piss myself, I realized that I needed to get out of there immediately. I slowly climbed back up the small cliff so as to not startle whatever that thing was. Once I got to the top, I saw that my brother was standing there and kicking the rock that he had previously been sitting on. At this point, my mind was just on us getting the hell out of the area and back to the house. I quickly stepped in his direction and told him that we needed to go. He asked if there was anything cool down in the creek, and I just kept telling him that we needed to get back to the house immediately. I knew that he could tell I saw something, but at this point, I figured it was best to not tell him what exactly, so that he didn't just freak out. He may have been 10, but he was still a bit of a child and was easily frightened. The two of us quickly ran back to the house, not pausing again until we were actually back in the yard and able to see the back door. That's when my brother asked me what we were running from. At the time, I didn't really know what to say to him about it. I had just seen some sort of wolf-like creature eating a deer in a ravine, and it legitimately had scared the hell out of me. I decided to just tell him that I saw a bear. He either wouldn't have believed what I actually saw, or he would have believed it and told our grandparents. So I never told my grandparents about what I saw out there, and I never told my brother what I actually saw either. He still thinks it was just a bear. I honestly have no idea what it was, but I know that it was not a bear, and that it wasn't a wolf either. It was some kind of mix of the two. That day was the last time the two of us ever ventured that far into the woods, and I never saw that thing again. My mom sold the land when my grandma passed away in the mid-90s. She didn't want to keep up with the farmland, being more of a suburban dweller. Honestly, I know that it could have turned out much, much worse. That thing could have gotten up and charged at me, and there's nothing I could have done to protect myself. Looking back now, I have no idea why it didn't stop eating the deer and come after me. The only thing I could think of was that it was satisfied with what it had already caught, and I wasn't big enough prey for it to give up its breakfast.
I was a butter bar platoon leader for a cav unit, and we were training at the National Training Center at Fort Benning. We were in the woods for a fire training exercise, and it takes about 4 days long and it involves a lot of land navigation. We had been out a few days and it had been pretty boring. About 1800 on the third day, I get a call from the company commander over the radio. He's pulling all the platoon leaders in and talking to us. All of the platoon leaders report to the company commander, and he tells us that there have been reports of a really big, aggressive bear that had been following groups around. If the bear shows up, just fire shots in the air to try to scare it off, and also, don't bury your trash. I was kind of annoyed by this, and I thought that it was just a big waste of time. At this point in the third day, it's pretty dark out, and I navigate back to my group. I was in warrior mode and I left my flashlight off so I wouldn't be spotted by the other groups. I'm following the trail back to the rendezvous point where my platoon were supposed to have set up a patrol base. While on the trail, I see headlights off in the distance, and I get off the trail and hide. I watch some Humvees pass by and look like range control or something. As the Humvees are driving by, I see its lights fall on something huge across the road for an instant before the Humvees drive on. I freak out for a second. I sit in utter silence for a few minutes, thinking it might be a bear. Nothing, no movement. After a while, I realize that I'm probably just being a tard and I get back on the trail. Nothing more out of the ordinary happens. I get around to the point where our patrol base should have been. I notice my group's chain lights heading off into the trail. So I follow into the woods and follow the lights. I get to the end of the chain lights and someone calls out a challenge. When you set up a patrol base, if you see someone, you call out a challenge phrase and they're supposed to answer back with a password. It means that they're friendly. I don't remember the password, so I just say, "It's me, don't worry about it." The guy that issued the challenge goes, whatever, and lets me by. I finally make it back to base, and all is well. About an hour goes by, and I feel weirdly tense. I can't sleep. Suddenly, shouting comes from one side of the patrol base, immediately followed by a hail of blank fire, as the whole squad lights up an area. I grab my rifle and I run over, shouting for a status from the squad leader. No response yet. No one is moving or talking. I run up to one of the sentries and ask them what had happened. He said that he saw someone moving about 10 meters away and asked their position and called out challenge. He said that he heard someone say what I had said in the same tone and everything. So they were going to let the person pass. The guy on patrol says that suddenly the thing got closer and he had a bad feeling about something. The person in question finally arrives to base, but it's not me obviously. This person, more like a creature, has long hair. The whole squad starts shooting blanks in his direction. If you've ever shot blanks at night, you know that it blinds you for a few seconds. When the guy on patrol can finally see again, he says that the guy was gone. I talk to the guy on patrol, and after some time, I go back to bed. A couple of hours later, however, I am awakened again by another hail of blank fire. Again, I grab my rifle and I run to the side of the patrol base where the fire's coming from. I get there, and almost no one is moving or talking. I ask, what the heck's going on? Team leader says he saw someone a little bit down the hill. They were watching us, so he issued a challenge. The guy called back, again, what I had responded earlier. Same tone, same inflections. The team leader is confused because he knows for a fact that I'm sleeping away in my bunk. The team leader is suspicious and figured maybe I had snuck out during the night. He asks me, or what he thinks is me, what I was doing out so late. The creature then responds what I had said earlier, except this time it doesn't make sense. It's out of context. The team leader is very confused. Finally, after some time, the team leader says he saw something, taller than normal, come out of the brush. Definitely was not a man. Again, naturally, the whole squad lights up whatever it was with the blank fire. Again, when everyone's able to see again, the guy is gone. Again, I go back to bed, and about 15 minutes later, the actual drill that we've been preparing for all week happens. I'm pretty excited and I grab my gun and join the gunfire. As part of the drill, we have to move locations and move our patrol base. During the drill, we have someone that is accountable for counting gear and counting people. The person that is accountable for counting all the gear and all the people now approaches me and says, when he counted the personnel in our group, he noticed that we had one too many people in our squad, so he counted again, and again we had one too many people. Considering that this was a training exercise, he figured that one of the people from the other squads accidentally ended up in our group, but we had no idea who. I then helped the person in charge of accountability and counted again. This time we had our numbers correct. Where did this person go? Who was he? Was it the same person that tried to enter our camp twice, using my callout? How come this person sounded like me? Who, or whatever it was, must have been close to me that night, when I made my call out, close enough that he could hear me. A part of me wishes that the night I walked back alone, that I actually had my flashlight on rather than off. But I figure that I'm pretty lucky, considering I was not able to see what followed me back to base. My parents used to be big outdoor buffs. My father is an ex-champion hobby boat racer, and my mother was an Alabama race country girl. They went on a trip with their friends when I was about 10 years old, and since then, they've refused to go camping anymore. Ever. My dad told me this story sometime after I had turned 18. My parents moved around a lot, and only had one set of friends that they really kept in touch with, Danny and Lisa. Danny and Lisa weren't actually outdoor nuts, but they liked to hang out with my parents, and did whatever they wanted to do. They all planned a 5-day trip to a lake south of where they lived with a creek that was on Danny's father's property, so they could keep camping and fish on the property all they wanted. My dad tells me that the first 2 days were normal, just camping, drinking, sharing stories while fishing and boating. The second night, though, was when things started to get weird. The second night, they kept hearing yelps coming from the woods. It sounded like 2 dogs were in a fight, but they were just both hurt and yelping the whole time. They figured they were just coyotes and slept. The next day, they continued on their adventures. That night, they kept hearing those noises again, except this time, they were extremely close. So my dad and Danny went out to see if they could scare them off, while my mom and Lisa stayed behind, being scared out of their minds, hiding in the tent. Anyway, my dad and Danny went looking in the woods for these coyotes that were fighting. My dad had a shotgun and Danny had a machete. My dad was just hoping to scare the coyotes, or whatever they were, with a loud gunshot. He wasn't actually trying to go kill them. They got to a clearing and could hear the noise, extremely loud, but it seemed to be coming from multiple directions. Now my dad was a bit of a kook. He swears that he saw Bigfoot at 14, but this is different. He just told Danny to get back. No questions, no explanations. Just, Danny, we need to get back. So they did, but the sounds didn't fade away this time. Danny nervously asked my dad what was going on, but my dad wouldn't tell him. He just kept shushing him. Danny is a bit of a goofball, hence why I always liked Danny, and called him my Uncle Danny, so he thought that my dad was getting back at him for a prank. Danny kept nudging my dad, trying to get him to say, "Gotcha," but my dad never untensed. Finally, they got close to the creek, a ways up from the camp, and my dad told Danny to run. Fast. Sprint. Then my dad took off. No remorse. Danny apparently followed, but tripped and called out to my dad. My dad, unfortunately, refused to go back for him, even though Danny started crying and calling out for help. Danny was yelling that his leg was broken, it hurt, etc., but my dad kept running. Then, my dad, my mother, and Lisa all hear a really loud cougar roar coming from the woods. My dad says it sounded like 2 lionesses roaring, but times 70. My dad says that it was so loud that it made his ears ring. After that roar, the cries from Danny had stopped. My dad got back to camp, and the ladies asked them what was going on, but my dad just said that there was something out there. My mother, being practical, says, "Well, yeah, no duh, but what was it?" My dad wouldn't answer. Lisa is freaking out and asking where Danny is, but my dad just keeps saying that he'll be here in a second. A few hours pass, and the ladies are extremely worried about Danny, while my dad would only cringe when they would say something. Finally, from the opposite side my dad had arrived from, Danny came walking out, just fine, wordlessly. My dad cocked his shotgun, but waved it as a survival readiness, something my mother says she'll never forget. This is when my mother knew that something was wrong. Danny then walks up to camp and nudges his way next to my mother, but after the weird looks that he's getting and the death glare from my father, he then moves closer to Lisa, who's been nagging at him for the next 10 minutes. But Danny would only grunt yes or no, or would just stare into the fire. My dad finally asked Danny what had happened to his leg, and Danny looked up confused. My dad told him, "I thought you said it was broken." Danny then looked up at him and replied, "Broken." Then, as if on cue, he starts screaming, "Oh, my leg! I think it's broken!" The ladies in the group obviously want to try to treat Danny's leg, but Danny doesn't seem to want any help. The ladies in the group rationalize and say that Danny must have been in shock, and that explains why he was acting so weird, but my dad isn't buying it. While the ladies are still trying to negotiate with Danny, my dad then suggests that, "Hey, let's just go to bed and we'll worry about it tomorrow." My mom gives him a look and my dad gives her another look, and they both agree to go to the tent. During the night, my parents said that they heard Lisa nagging to Danny, and he would never reply to any of her responses. Being enraged, she then finally says that she's going to go out in the woods and pee. Danny asks if he could come with her since there were animals out in the woods. She says okay, and they left. My dad woke up about 10ish in the morning and started making breakfast. Danny and Lisa were gone. My mom asked where they were, and my dad would not reply. After a little while, they both came back, rather unceremoniously, and without a word. They weren't holding hands, and they were not in each other's arms as usual, just kind of awkwardly standing next to each other. They refused food, and Danny would randomly yell out, "My leg," and Lisa would randomly complain about feeling ill. My mom then suggested that they go home and call off the trip on account of Danny's leg. Danny had not been limping at all. Danny and Lisa just nodded. My father just kind of watched. They all agreed, so Danny and Lisa got in my parents' car, not theirs, and just waited. They didn't pack up anything, any coolers, tents, bags, anything. My mom came over and asked if they were going to grab their things, and they just shook their heads. My dad asked, "Why don't you take your car?" And they both said, "Broken," just like Danny had the night before. My dad sighed and packed up the car and they drove off. Danny and Lisa stayed quiet the whole way, and except for their random mumblings to each other, completely indecipherable. My parents then took them home, and they came and got me afterwards from the babysitter. I could tell that something was wrong, besides coming back a couple days early. They said that Danny got hurt, so they had to come home. I remember asking if I could go see Danny and Lisa, but my dad replied, "No," a little too quickly, and so I thought that he was mad at them. I remember this as a child because they were kind of my friends too, and I figured my dad was just being mean. A few weeks later, I asked about Uncle Danny, and my dad said that we're not going to see them anymore. I was mad, and so I demanded to know why. He told me something about his dad being sick, and so I was really sad. Then I forgot about it and life went on. Fast forward 5 years. I am at the supermarket where I used to live and remembered that Danny and Lisa lived not too far away from here. Now that I was able to drive, I decided to drive around and see if I could find Danny and Lisa's old home. I'm driving rather slowly and kinda creepily to see if I can find Danny and Lisa's old home. Sure enough, I spot Danny walking down the street. I'm really excited and I flag him down and pull over. He seems kinda stiff, kind of robotic. When I got out and hugged him, he seemed way too tight and felt like he was trying to smother me. I had asked him how he'd been and he said alright. I asked him how Lisa was and where they were, and asked if I could see her. He agreed. I asked about all the mutual friends that we had, and he seemed kind of confused, like he didn't remember about 90% of them, which seemed odd, mainly because Danny was my awesome involved uncle. Being a bit paranoid, I decided to ask him a couple of trick questions. He failed miserably. Now, I'm a bit nervous. We get to his door and he opens it, and the smell hits me like a garbage truck. It smells like a meat locker that had went out of business and they left all the meat inside. The smell literally assaulted my nostrils. The place was a wreck, just crap everywhere. Everything is coated in dust and crap and nothing looks clean. Laundry is everywhere. No lights are on and it's just a mess. Now I'm really freaking out. I ask him, "Danny, what's going on here?" He just lets out this weird guttural grunt. I asked about Lisa, and I hear a yell coming from the kitchen. The kitchen was just the next room over, and I could hear and smell something cooking. I walked into the kitchen, expecting to see Lisa making some normal food and planning to ask Lisa and Danny what had happened, and why they were acting so weird. But when I walked into the kitchen, I saw something really disturbing. It was unforgettable. Lisa was standing in the kitchen, but she's completely naked, covered in blood and this mangled mess, surrounded by thousands of bones. I was just smart enough to notice a pile of dog collars in the corner. Obviously, being disturbed with what I saw, I let out a yell and Danny lunged at me. I clumsily ran out of the room and out of the house, Danny chasing me the entire way. I made it back to my home and told my parents what had happened. My dad looked like he wanted to punch me in the face. We called the police and the police investigated. They came back and said that no one was in the home, but everything matched about the story I told them. The place was a complete wreck. The police said some BS story that me and my father didn't believe. They told us that maybe some hobos had lived there and they ate the cats and dogs in the neighborhood. Obviously, we didn't believe them, and my father asked them why the house had not been foreclosed. They stammered, considering that they knew that we were onto them. And we later found out that Danny's parents actually were paying for the home. But my encounter and my father's story makes everything all the more weird. After my final and last encounter with Danny and Lisa, I finally agree with my parents that I will never go camping again.
My first day at middle school. Middle school. The concept strikes fear. Just so much of it is unknown. New teachers, new classes, an overwhelming tidal wave of new students. Today was Connor's first day. He woke at 6 as his cat adjusted herself on his pillow. He hit the shower and got dressed. He decided a few months ago that Dad would drop him off a block away and he'd walk to the entrance himself. His dad pulled up curbside and Connor got out. As he approached the school, Connor looked for his friends from elementary. He also was trying to avoid the pole. The pole was the elementary school bully, tall and thin like a pole. This was the one guy Connor could do without. Connor walked through the front entrance into the main hallway. Every kid held onto a piece of paper which showed which classroom they should go to. Connor's class schedule told him that new student assembly was to be held in room 8. Suddenly, dread surged through his body, as at the far end of the hallway he saw the pole. The pole hadn't noticed Connor yet, so Connor slowly backed up. Wham! He smashed into a girl running down the hallway. Her books went flying. His schedule hit the ground also. She scooped hers up without any apology and ran off.
Not even a sorry?
He picked up his paper, but something seemed strange. It was creased like a triangle. Connor didn't remember folding it like that.
Huh?
He didn't recall his first class being in room B. He thought it said room 8. Perhaps he just read it wrong. Grasping his schedule, he raced to room B. He entered. It was the largest classroom he had ever seen. An auditorium the size of a basketball court, which seemed more like a movie theater with its stadium seating. It was packed with kids, but he saw some empty seats in the middle. Just then, he brushed elbows with a girl. She smiled cutely back before walking into the center aisle. He followed. She turned and their eyes met. She smiled again as she sat down. He sat next to her and the room hushed. A teacher walked to the front and center to the podium. In the silence, Connor could hear every step. The teacher was tall and thin, creepy looking.
Welcome to your first day of 6th grade at Pirk Middle School.
There was something bizarre about the teacher's face. His left eye was blinking uncontrollably. The left eye would blink, then the right eye would blink. It was odd. Connor had never seen anything like it.
While I know most of you, I see a few fresh faces I don't recognize. Stand up if you're new.
What? This was embarrassing. But the girl next to him stood, as did 2 boys a few rows down. Connor slowly rose from his seat as 200 eyes latched onto him.
Introduce yourselves.
The 2 boys said their names were Zachnid and Rashbird. The girl said she was a Rashbird too. Huh. A really strange name for both of them to have. But Connor didn't have too much time to really think about it. As of now, it was his turn. He was about to speak when a large bang came in from the back of the room. All eyes turned to where an out-of-breath girl entered at breakneck speed.
Sit down.
Hold on. That girl. She was the one who bumped into Connor in the hallway and didn't say sorry. If she was in this class, then that meant Connor was in the wrong place.
If you're ever late again, I'll rip out your heart and serve it for lunch.
Whoa. That teacher was scary. No wonder everyone was so quiet. The girl rushed to an empty seat. Connor sat down too. Happy he didn't have to announce himself to the entire class.
Today's lesson is a refresher on the creatures amongst us.
The creatures amongst us?
Werewolves, vampires, snakeheads, spider crawls, zacnids, and rashbirds. We fall into those 7 categories.
Huh?
What on earth is he talking about? Connor glanced across the auditorium. All listened intently. All eyes were on the teacher. It was very strange. They were all staring like robots.
Why, we live amongst them and go to school with them, the humans. We must never let them know we exist. Death to you and your family awaits anyone who does so. Okay. Separate into your species. Vampires, in this corner.
At that, many stood and walked to the corner.
Werewolves, over here, please.
Half the remaining kids stood. For a split second, Connor looked around for hidden cameras. Was this a first-date prank?
Spider crawlers to the ceiling.
The worst chill imaginable overtook Connor's body as kids crawled up the walls and stuck above him. He now knew this wasn't a joke.
Snakeheads. Are there any snakeheads?
A sad-looking boy raised his hand.
You, over here, by me.
The boy sheepishly walked over to the teacher.
Zacnids here.
Connor frantically looked around. Was he the only one who didn't belong?
Rashbirds, this corner.
The girl next to Connor stood. It was then he noticed a rash on the side of her neck. Others who joined her in the corner also had the same rash. Connor didn't know what to do. Should he follow? Would he be found out? He hesitated, and then went for the exit. But the door was locked. Unfortunately, the vampires had noticed his attempted escape, and as they whispered amongst themselves, their piercing eyes latched upon him. He started to back away, but then he saw the spider crawls above him, circling him on the ceiling. Tears drizzled from his eyes, realizing everyone was watching him.
You're not one of us.
There wasn't anywhere for him to go. He slowly shook his head.
No.
Class, may this be a lesson to you all. If the human is allowed to leave here, then our secret will be out. They will hunt us down and kill us.
He turned back to Connor.
Your fear will be over shortly.
The teacher motioned the sad boy towards Connor.
Kill.
The sad boy opened his jaw wide.
Kill! Kill!
A snakehead shot out of the boy's mouth and latched its teeth onto Connor's face. Connor's head snapped back and... Connor woke as his cat adjusted herself on his pillow. Still shaken from his dream, Connor approached the shower. The dream had felt so real, and Connor was still nervous. Of course, his parents thought it was because this was his first day at middle school. As his dad dropped him off at the corner, he felt a horrible feeling of déjà vu. Connor walked through the front entrance into the school, where he saw everyone with their class schedules in hand. Still dazed, he glanced towards the pole at the far end of the hallway When unapologetic girl with the books crashed into him. Again, she scooped up the wrong schedule, but before he could tell her, she rushed away. Nervously, he watched her disappear around the corner. Connor slowly bent down and picked up the dropped piece of paper. He flipped it over, and sure enough, it was the girl's, and it read Room B. His eyes instantly locked onto a trash bin, but just as he was going to throw it away, he was shoved forward, falling hard on the ground. As he looked up, the pole towered over him.
Oops!
The pole snatched Connor's paper from his hand.
Where's assembly?
The pole looked over the schedule.
Room B.
He scrunched it into a ball and then threw it at Connor.
I'll see you at recess.
The pole shoved Connor back and walked away. Wait, if the bully read the girl's paper, then he was on his way to the snakehead room. Connor had to do something.
Wait!
The bully turned around.
What?
Connor paused.
Nothing.
Clara laid unconscious on the cold linoleum floor. Her breath was ragged and a deep purple began to form around her eyes. I had rushed in only a moment earlier after hearing her screams from the other side of the house. Stunned, I stood there in disbelief. What had happened to her? Who did this, and where did they go? Were all questions running through my mind. I stooped down to check on her. A few firm shakes did nothing to rouse her. A check on her pulse indicated that her heart rate was normal. Getting up from the floor, I noticed the discoloration around her eyes began to shift and move. A large lump formed like all the blood was pooling in one spot. Then it began to make its way towards her nose. Revulsion coursed through my stomach, and dry heaves doubled me over once a black substance poured from her nostrils. It had the appearance of an inky, shiny black slug and came out in long, thick rivulets. "What the hell?" I screamed in between stomach convulsions. It inched its way closer to me. In desperation, I stomped on it with my shoed foot. Relief etched across my face for a moment as the thought that I had taken care of the problem crossed my mind. That relief was only temporary, for in the next moment, the black inky slug began to come from under my foot and wrap itself around my shoe. Screams of terror erupted from my mouth while I kicked the shoe off across the bathroom. Like a bat out of hell, I ran as fast as I could out of there. Whatever happened to Clara, I wasn't going to let happen to me. Straight up the stairs, into the bedroom I went, then locked the door behind me. In a fit of self-preservation, I began to barricade the door with anything I could find. Once I had most of the furniture from the room in front of the door, I thought of how the thing was like a liquid and crawled. With this in mind, I removed everything from in front of the entryway and took all the shirts and clothes I could find and began to jam them in the cracks around the door frame. Then when that was done, I put all the furniture back in front of the door again, just in case. Stewing in paranoia, I paced the room, unsure of what to do next. Cops. What could the police do against something like that? What was it anyways? Was Clara all right down there? I know I shouldn't have left her alone with that thing, but I couldn't let it do to me whatever it had done to her. Panic was about to completely consume me when I heard a knock on the door. "Clara, is that you?" I asked. "Frank, it's me. What are you doing in there?" I heard Clara respond. "Is it gone? Are you all right?" I said. "Yeah, I'm fine. I think I fainted for some reason. I don't know why. Frank, could you open up the door?" Without thinking, I rushed to remove all the junk I had piled up. It took about 2 minutes to get the doorway cleared out. There she was, standing in front of the door. It looked like nothing had even happened to her. "Where is it? Did you see it go anywhere?" I said. "Where is what, Frank? I faint and you barricade yourself in the room. Something wrong with you?" Clara said as she walked into the room. "I'm gonna go look for it. I want to make sure everything is safe." "All right, but first, come give me a hug." "I'm still a little shaken up from passing out," Clara said while she gently reached for my hand. She held me in a tight embrace and nuzzled into my neck. She felt like Clara, soft, safe, and warm, but her hair smelled different. Normally she smelled the daffodils and lilies. Now she had a faint petrol scent to her. Her long blonde hair tickled my nose, so I stepped back. Her eyes were still blue and bright. Her lips had a blush to them. In all, she looked perfectly fine. "I'm gonna go look now. I'm glad you're okay," I said. "Why don't you stay? I'm sure whatever you saw is long gone by now." "I could use a little cuddle to make me feel better," Clara said. "No, I think I need to make sure," I replied. "All right, I'll stay here and put the bed back together," she said, then gave me a little wink. For later. Seemed like an odd time to flirt, but I thought that maybe she had hit her head when she fell or something and headed off. First stop was the bathroom. Nothing was out of place and no sign of the ink slug. When I went by the kitchen on my way back to the bedroom, I was hit with the faint smell of petrol again. I followed the smell into the kitchen where it got much stronger, then past the kitchen into the living room. Rank fumes were practically overwhelming me at this point. The noxious scent caused tears to well in my eyes. Without being able to discern where it was coming from, I began to search the closets and doorways nearby. Went to the garage, but the smell actually faded in there. Checked both closets back in the living room and found nothing there as well. When I opened the door to the basement, I finally had to pull my shirt over my nose. Almost went and flipped on the light switch, but then thought better of it. If there was a gas leak or something, I didn't want it to explode. So I went back to the kitchen and grabbed the flashlight. Down in the basement, with only a small beam of light to show the way, was not the smartest move to make. Looking back, how did I expect to find a small black slug in a pitch-black room with only a flashlight and poor visibility? I should have called the gas company to check for a leak, then turned on the light. Sometimes in a panic, you just don't think. Went all the way to the back wall, then turned left and followed it all the way to the end. That's when I saw Clara standing there, not moving, not breathing, but still upright. If I hadn't have known better, I would have thought that she was a mannequin. A silent scream pushed its way out of my mouth, and I dropped the light. Clara, dear God, what's happened?" I said, then ran up to check on her. No pulse. She was cold to the touch, dead. Her lifeless body stood there in some sort of complete rigor mortis. Turning, I fumbled along the ground to pick up the flashlight. Before I could stand, I felt something hard hit the back of my head. Consciousness faded in and out as I was pulled up the stairs by my feet, my head hitting each and every step. "Frank, I told you should have come and snuggled me." "That's all right, we'll do it now," Clara said as she leaned over my semi-conscious body. Her tongue, well, actually no, her proboscis went to my mouth, down my throat, past my stomach, and stopped somewhere in my intestines. I could feel her injecting her black slimy mucus into the depths of my body. The pain was horrific as it slowly dissolved my guts while she slurped them back up. Once she finished her meal of my insides and had sucked all of the soft tissue out, she planted her fertilized egg inside of me. You see, I think you've mistaken this story. This isn't a story about my death. This is actually an account of my birthday. I look, act, talk, and have all of Frank's memories. The only difference is that I am now a part of the collective. Some of you might call it a hive mind. There is no more need for individual thought, no need to think, no emotions, no pain, no love. We don't get sick either. The reason we're telling you this story is that we know there will be many of you that will willingly join us. Those that won't join willingly, well, let's just say they'll join us eventually.
Feeling lonely? Did your family pet just bite it? No worries, we have the solution for you. With these simple steps, you can find yourself a new faithful companion straight from the depths of hell. All you'll need is salt, a knife, we recommend a small one so it's easy to fit in your pocket and it won't get in the way, 3 candles, something to light it with, obviously. Now, they don't need to be scented, but it would be preferable. Also, a short wooden rod with a point on one end, and some paper. Now that you have what you need, locate a room with minimal sources of light. Now, the place doesn't need to be in your house, but if you were to try this, the place should hold some meaning to you. You need to start the ritual at 12 o'clock a.m. For the best results, attempt this on All Hallows Eve, better known to you mortals as Halloween. Now that you have a location, date, and time, you're ready to start. Settle down in your chosen room. Lock each and every entrance, putting a generous line of salt in front of each. Make sure that there is as little amount of light entering the room as possible. Now that you've prepped the room, make a circle of salt in the middle big enough for you to sit in. Next, set the candles down in front of you in the shape of a triangle. Once you've lit them, sit in the circle. We hope that you haven't forgotten anything outside of the circle, because at this point, you can't leave until the ritual is done, or it won't work. Now for the remainder of the instructions, we ask that you listen carefully. Do not attempt to record your experience. Our friends down under, and I'm not talking about Australians, don't take kindly to being filmed, and the safety precautions that you've put in place won't matter if you attempt to film them. This is also a one-person experience. No friends, no family, no one but you is allowed to attempt this. We can't guarantee your safety if you bring along a buddy. Now back on track. Circle made, candles down, and you're sitting in the circle. Now it's time for your knife. Whip out that bad boy, and we really hope you didn't bring a butter knife or you're in for a bad time. And make a small cut. Don't go too deep, we don't want you bleeding out now. Then use the wooden rod and dip the pointed end into your blood. Take out that paper and let's start writing. For this part you want to write each word exactly. Let's begin. I, enter your name here, do solemnly vow to offer a fraction of my undying soul as an offering to the beings of the abyss, to bring into this world a companion of my design, to aid me in any task that I see fit, to stay by my side until the day that my soul is ripped from my shell and dragged down into the gates of the unholy. This is my contract, and this is my vow. I offer my soul as payment. When you're done, take your thumb and put it onto the cut that you've made. Make sure that it's covered generously, and put a thumbprint on the lower right corner of the paper. Why you ask that you need a thumbprint when you just wrote the contract in your blood? I don't know. I don't make the rules. With that being done, the lit candles should flicker out. Then they will relight, and a strong smell of sulfur will engulf the room. This is where the scented candles will come in handy. When this happens, close your eyes. Do not open them. This is a time when you design your pet. Imagine them however you like. It could be terrifying, looking like something out of a twisted mind, or it could be friendly looking. We do recommend the latter. You will have to be living with this thing for the rest of your life. You'll get to pick almost every aspect of its appearance. Its height, its weight, its eye color, all that good stuff. But remember, no matter how appealing it looks, it will always be a demon. Once you're done, the smell of sulfur will leave the room. You can now open your eyes, and standing before you is your very own demon. But don't leave the circle yet. To make sure that the beast is actually under your control, issue it a command. But not any command. Tell it to kneel before you. Although demons are tricksters, no demon wants to kneel before a human. But thanks to that contract, it has no choice. If the demon kneels, congratulations! You are now in possession of your very own hell creature. This will assist you in any task that you ask him to. Is your boss annoying you? Send your new buddy after him and he'll make the problem disappear without any suspicion coming your way. Want to win the lottery? Let it tell you what card to pick. Or, if you just want someone to talk to, I can guarantee you that every last one of our demons is a great listener. But, if your demon does not kneel, you've done something wrong. Something terribly wrong. And sad to say, not really, you'll probably be visiting the abyss sooner than you expected. Your demon will stay by your side always. You'll feel its presence while you sleep, while you eat, even those private moments when you're sitting on your porcelain throne, dropping a big one. You might not always be able to see it, for it might be lounging in your shadow, but it will always be there. And don't worry about other people seeing it. They'll only be able to if you add their names to the contract. Also, don't let the contract be destroyed. That piece of paper is the only thing that keeps your new best friend from ripping out your throat. You might want to get it laminated or something. So, now that you know what to do, get out there, kids, and summon your very own best friend. And if you have any more questions, feel free to call the number 1-800-666-666.
Pale Luna. Written by Mihai Honoridis. In the last decade and a half, it's become infinitely easier to obtain exactly what you're looking for. By way of a couple of keystrokes, the internet has made it all too simple to use a computer to change reality. An abundance of information is merely a search engine away, to the point where it's hard to imagine life as any different. Yet, a generation ago, when the words streaming and torrent were meaningless save for conversations about water, people met face to face to conduct software swap parties, trading games and applications on Sharpie labeled 5 1/4-inch floppies. Of course, most of the time, the meets were a way for frugal, community-minded individuals to trade popular games like King's Quest and Maniac Mansion amongst themselves. However, a few early programming talents designed their own computer games to share amongst their circle of acquaintances, who in turn would pass it on until, if fun and well-designed enough, an independently developed game had its place in the collection of aficionados across the country. Think of it as the 80s equivalent of a viral video. Pale Luna, on the other hand, was never circulated outside of the San Francisco Bay Area. All known copies have been long disposed of. All computers that have ever run the game, now detritus, buried under layers of filth and polystyrene. The fact is attributed to a number of rather abstruse design choices made by its programmer. Pale Luna was a text adventure in the vein of Zork and The Lurking Horror, at a time when said genre was swiftly going out of fashion. Upon booting the program, the player was presented with a screen almost completely blank, except for the text. You are in a dark room. Moonlight shines through the window. There is gold in the corner, along with a shovel and a rope. There is a door to the east. Command? So began the game that one writer for a long out-of-print fanzine decried as enigmatic, nonsensical, and completely unplayable, as the only commands that the game would accept were pick up gold, pick up shovel, pick up rope, open door, and go east. The player was soon presented with the following: reap your reward. Pale Luna smiles at you. You are in a forest. There are paths to the north, west, and east. Command? What quickly infuriated the few who've played the game was the confusing and buggy nature of the second screen onward. Only one of the directional decisions would be the correct one. For example, on this occasion, a command to go in a direction other than north would lead to the system freezing, requiring the operator to hard reboot the entire computer. Further, any subsequent screens seemed to merely repeat the above text, with the difference being only the directions available. Worse still, the standard text adventure commands appeared to be useless. The only accepted non-movement related prompts were use gold, which caused the game to display the message, not here, use shovel, which brought up not now, and use rope, which prompted the text, you've already used this. Most who played the game progressed a couple of screens into it before becoming fed up by having to constantly reboot and tossing the disc in disgust, writing off the experience as a shoddily programmed farce. However, there is one thing about the world of computers that remains true. No matter the era, some people who use them have way too much time on their hands. A young man by the name of Michael Nevins decided to see if there was more to Pale Luna than met the eye. 5 hours and 33 screens worth of trial and error and unplugged computer cords later, he finally managed to make the game display different text. The text in this new area read, Pale Luna smiles wide. There are no paths. Pale Luna smiles wide. The ground is soft. Pale Luna smiles wide. Here. Command. It was another hour before Nevin stumbled upon the proper combinations of phrases to make the game progress any further. Dig hole, drop gold, then fill hole. This caused the screen to display, congratulations, 40.24248, minus 121.4434. Upon which the game ceased to accept commands, requiring the user to reboot one last time. After some deliberation, Nevins came to the conclusion that the numbers referred to lines of latitude and longitude. The coordinates led to a point in the sprawling forest that dominated the nearby Lassen's volcanic park. As he possessed much more free time than sense, Nevins vowed to see Pale Luna through to its ending. The next day, armed with a map, a compass, and a shovel, he navigated the park's trails, noting with amusement how each turn he made corresponded roughly to those that he took in game. Though he initially regretted bringing the cumbersome digging tool on a mere hunch, the path's similarity all but confirmed his suspicions that the journey would end with him face to face with an eccentric's buried treasure. Out of breath, after a tricky struggle to the coordinates, he was pleasantly surprised by a literal stumble upon a patch of uneven dirt. Shoveling as excitedly as he was, it would be an understatement to say that he was taken aback when his heavy strokes unearthed the badly decomposing head of a blonde-haired little girl. Nevins promptly reported the situation to the authorities. The girl was identified as Karen Paulson, 11, reported as missing to the San Diego Police Department a year and a half prior. Efforts were made to track down the programmer of Pale Luna, but the nearly anonymous legal gray area in which the software swapping community operated inescapably led to many dead ends. Collectors have been known to offer upwards of 6 figures for an authentic copy of the game. The rest of Karen's body was never found.
As an atheist, I'd always imagined that when my life ended, it would be as if the universe had flipped my switch to the off position, senses, emotion, etc., all blinking to nothingness and silence, like I had never existed at all. This assumption couldn't have been further from the truth. The first thing I noticed when I looked around was that this place looked very much like a doctor's office, but at the same time, very different. The room was divided into 3 sections. In the center was the widest of them. It had red carpet, one half looking brand new. The other half looked as though someone had set it on fire, then put it out again by stamping and smearing the ash everywhere. We stood in this area, a throng of at least 100, cordoned off on either side by ancient movie theater rope. At the front was a reception window with 3 rows. The cordon opened at the top of each side, where there were 5 office desks, at which sat expressionless assistants mindlessly typing away at their computers. Where the hell am I? I wondered. The closest person to me looked like a businessman of some sort. He wore an expensive blue shirt with that stupid white collar, black slacks, and fancy shoes he probably made his servants polish 3 times a fucking day. He was frowning and messing with his iPhone like he was trying to get reception. "Hey man, where are—" I started to ask. "Screw off," he interjected, pushing me with his shoulder as he shuffled away. Never even looked up from his damn phone. I scanned the crowd to discover this weird mixed bag of Wall Street guys and what I thought might be a church group. They gave that missionary vibe, a few of them holding these tiny copies of the New Testament. There were only a few of us average Joes, huddled toward the back of the 2 larger groups. Everyone seemed emotionally dead. I caught a few of those smirks, though, the ones that tell you which individuals view themselves as superior, or that I was gross, or maybe both of these. Whatever, I know I dress like a hippie, but I ain't nasty or dumb. Pricks. I remember thinking. At any rate, I didn't see anyone talking to me anytime soon. And based on the volume of us corralled, I'd be there a while. I glanced over at the nearest assistant, if that's what the fuck they were called, I saw she was free and inquired, "Excuse me, can you tell me where I am?" Nothing. Name? Location? Anything at all, if you don't mind, that is. My sarcastic side leaked through on that last bit, which I expected her to get irritated at like most people I cross paths with. But she didn't. There was only silence. I didn't think this place could be anything like purgatory or limbo. Quietly, I resigned myself to waiting out this mass of dimwits before getting to any concrete info. That's when, from close behind me, I heard, "Hey, what's your name?" I turned to see a skinny kid with long brown dreadlocks smiling at me. He wore a dingy t-shirt, ripped jeans, and a worn-out pair of Converse. My kind of people. "Hi, I'm Mora. What's yours?" "Ned," he replied, saying, "You look like you could use a smoke." He produced a pack of Marlboro Reds, offering one and lighting another for himself. No one called him out, so I bummed his lighter and followed suit. I took a long draw, that familiar sweet but biting sensation of the nicotine flooding my lungs. Weird how we can still feel shit, huh? I nodded and took another hit. Then I repeated the question. "So do you know where the hell we are?" He exhaled, laughing under his breath as he answered. "Can't you tell?" He took another puff, raising his eyes to look around. "We're in the fucking waiting room." For the first time, I noticed that the motif of the rest of the room was very much like that of the carpet. The right side was totally new and clean. The left, while not badly burned like the floor, had no doubt seen better days. The white walls and beige trim were cracked, peeling, and faded, as was the tile on the floor. The appearance of the assistants differed greatly as well. Though both sides wore white outfits with beige cardigans, the men and women to the right were crisp in appearance, as if someone had 3D copied them from a 50s edition of Good Housekeeping. Crisp. While on the left, well, to be honest, it was as though a building had just collapsed on them and they had gone straight back to work. Their clothes were tattered, covered in debris. They were completely disheveled in general. A few people even had wounds dripping blood everywhere. Yet still, they tapped away at their keyboards. Who got sent where was pretty obvious from this setup. I shuddered at the concept of this being reality, trying to hit my cigarette again. It had burned down though, so I looked at Ned and inquired if he would mind donating another. He told me no problem, and found that the ones we'd removed had reappeared. Damn, we both breathed. We lit up again and took a few more hits before he looked at me and asked, "So what happened to you?" I thought as hard as I could. Well, it's really blurry. It happened so fast. But I think it was a car wreck. Like I crazy flipped. I'm just fucking glad it was quick. I laughed and shot the question back at him, noticing his smile break slightly. His jaw tensed for a moment before he said, "I overdosed." My empathy meter shot through the roof. Shit, I'm sorry, man. I had an accidental myself once. "Nah," he said. "It wasn't like that. I fired up enough heroin to kill a horse. Knew exactly what I was doing." He looked directly into my eyes, all lightheartedness having dispersed. I never believed in heaven, hell, any of that bullshit. I was tired, just couldn't handle it out there anymore, you know? I wanted quiet. But since I'm here now, I'm pretty sure wherever the fuck I wind up won't be any place peaceful at all. I knew exactly what he meant, or at least related to those thoughts. I'd often longed for that quiet myself in my own morbid fantasies. Ned was solemn for a few minutes, then we struck up our conversation again. We continued talking like that until we felt as though eons had passed, and we fell back into silence like those around us. Eventually, the majority of the snobbish groups wound up on the left. On the other hand, some people even I would have expected to go that way were sent to the right instead. That gave me hope for Ned, at least. It wasn't long before he came to the middle line, which I'd ascertained was the check-in point. There his name would be taken, and they would ping him in his direction. Then he would receive an index card, of whose purpose I was unaware, and he would be off to whatever great beyond awaited him. He stepped to the window, and then was sent to the left. My heart sank for him. As he approached the first empty desk, I could tell he was doing his best to remain staunch, disciplined, accepting of his fate. I could see the internal terror behind his eyes, though, at whatever destiny that might entail. Just as he lowered his ass into the wretched chair, a phone rang loudly behind the front left window. The woman snatched it tersely from the receiver, listened for a moment, then slammed it back down without speaking a word. She motioned for Ned to return, where he gratefully returned his index card and swiftly made his way to the right-hand side of the waiting area. I could have leapt for joy for the poor guy, as I'd hoped that didn't happen to me, even though he'd been the only one this occurred with. I thought I saw tears running down his cheeks, and the biggest smile was on his face. Being next, I stepped up to the center aisle window. The woman behind the glass looked confused when she saw my face, frantically typing away and searching through a tall filing cabinet which stood a few feet behind her. I guess she couldn't find me in the system. She turned back, exasperatedly threw her hands into the air, and exclaimed, "Moira Addison, what the fuck are you even doing here?" I was both shocked and amused, but before I could react, she punched a button somewhere above her and told me to come back later. Much later. The floor began to shake violently. I almost shouted, thinking it was an earthquake. Then I realized it was a strong, steady vibration that seemed to come from all around. Suddenly, the ceiling parted, a blinding white glow enveloping me in a searing wave of heat. Everything went black. When I opened my eyes again, I found myself in a hospital bed. My parents were there. I asked them what happened, but they were hysterical. I had no idea why. Later, I got the full scoop from my doctor, who informed me that I'd been in a crash involving myself and multiple other vehicles. Having suffered critical injuries, I lapsed into a coma, where I had remained for the next 6 months. None of the doctors believed I would wake up at all. My parents had felt it selfish to keep me there for themselves, and had decided to let me go. But when they pulled the plug and turned off all the machines, I took a sharp gasp and within moments woke up. I won't bore you with the details of my arduous recovery. I just had to get this out in hopes of sharing it with, well, anyone who might believe it, really. And best of luck, by the way, when you find yourself in the waiting room.
The rainy season began in early summer, and June had been no exception. It did not surprise the man when he discovered rainwater dripping from his dining room ceiling. Shrugging it off, he placed a tall pot beneath the leak and expected it to stop on its own. However, it continued to rain, and before he knew it, the pot would threaten to overflow. He had to dump the water out first thing in the morning, and straight after, he returned home from work. Eventually, he began to notice water damage at the source of the leak. The white ceiling had discolored, turning a dull shade of brown. He checked the weather and realized that it would continue to rain sporadically over the next 10 days. The man was worried about the ceiling mildewing and became an expensive repair, so he would call a local handyman. Unfortunately, the man could not sign to have the repairs done, only his landlord could. It was a frustrating policy. The man called his landlord, but he couldn't reach him. He left him a few voicemails detailing how the damage was becoming progressively worse. The man was clueless as to why his landlord would not return his calls. They usually kept in touch, speaking at least twice a month. Finally, he reasoned that he would not be held accountable for any damages sustained. One night, the man was startled awake by a massive thump. He quickly turned on his bedside lamp, and just vaguely he could see an overturned table and a large shape laying across it. He sprinted out of his apartment and called the police, gagging at the smell. The man sat in the police station with a blanket wrapped around his shoulders and a coffee mug resting in his hands. He did know one thing: there had been a body in his ceiling, and the water had saturated so badly that it caved under the weight. So far, the body was unidentifiable due to the rainwater, and it was being autopsied. While the man waited, he called his landlord and finally reached him. Panicking as he explained the situation, his landlord was just as alarmed as the man, and he pleaded for him to come down to the station while he made a statement. The man paused as a detective crossed over to him, and he lowered his phone, wondering if the body had been identified. His blood ran immediately cold, and he shook his head with terror. The body belonged to Richard Thompson, his landlord, and he had died over a year ago. That's not what disturbed him the most. If his landlord was dead, then who was pretending to be him? When I was in high school, there was one boy in my class who was very, very strange looking. Most of the other kids were afraid of him, and everybody kept out of his way. He always kept to himself and never spoke to anyone. His name was Craig, but we gave him the nickname Crazy Eyes. He had the strangest eyes you had ever seen. They were large, round, bugged out, and disturbing. They didn't look human. It was as if they belonged to some sort of exotic reptile, like a chameleon or a lizard. During class, he remained completely silent, never asking or answering any questions. I got the impression that the teachers were scared of him as well. All he did was stare at everyone with his huge, bugged-out eyes, creeping them all out with that unsettling gaze of his. One Monday morning, we had a media class. The teacher split us up into groups and gave us the task of making a short film. Due to the luck of the draw, Craig was assigned to our group. While we gathered around and discussed ideas, he kept his mouth tightly shut and just stared at us all with his big, bulbous eyes. We eventually came up with an idea for a slasher movie. The plot involved a crazed killer who goes around the school stabbing people. Craig was so odd-looking that we unanimously decided that he should play the killer. His crazy eyes made him the obvious choice. As it turned out, the movie was a great big success. We managed to create a 5-minute film that looked almost as professional as a Hollywood horror flick. Surprisingly, Craig did a great job in his role as the killer. We shot hours of footage of him stalking the school grounds, running from tree to tree. He was armed with a fake knife that had a retractable blade. Then we filmed him stabbing a bunch of kids who were playing the victims. They were soaked from head to toe with fake blood. Taking part in the movie, Craig really seemed to come out of his shell. He took to acting like fish to water. When filming was complete, we all noticed a big change in his personality. Somehow it boosted his confidence, and although he still didn't talk very much, he held his head up high and seemed more sure of himself. On Friday, when we screened the film for the entire class, they loved it and started chanting, "Craig, Craig, Craig." That day, he was the most popular kid in the class and seemed to revel in the attention. However, when Monday morning arrived, Crazy Eyes Craig was nowhere to be seen. He didn't show up for school and nobody seemed to know where he was. For the rest of the week, he was absent from school. That weekend, I was at home working on an assignment for school. I overheard a report on the news about an attempted murder that had happened in our town. Shocked, I glanced up from my work, and when I set eyes on the picture they were showing on the TV screen, a chill ran down my spine. It was Craig. His humongous, crazy eyes stared at me from the TV screen as the news reporter continued with the story. Apparently, he had been stalking his next-door neighbor. She was a 16-year-old girl named Leanne. She, her younger sister, and her mother had been home alone while her father was away on business. The two girls stayed up late watching a horror movie on TV. It was A Nightmare on Elm Street. During the movie, they started to notice something strange. They opened up a box of cereal and took 2 bowls into the living room to eat, but when Leanne went back to the kitchen, she found that the box was empty. When the movie finished, the girls went upstairs to get ready for bed. Leanne opened her bedroom closet and found Craig standing there, holding a hatchet. He was dressed in her mother's clothes and had makeup smeared all over his face. He told her to be quiet and tied her up. Then he fetched her mother and her sister and marched them to the back room. He tied up them as well and left all 3 laying on the floor. He told them that he was going to kill them and that he'd be right back, so they better start praying. The police said he went downstairs to ransack the house and steal valuables. While he was gone, the youngest girl managed to wiggle free of her bonds. She jumped out the window and ran to a nearby house to raise the alarm. Within minutes, the police were breaking down the front door. They ran up the stairs with their guns drawn and found Leanne and her mother lying hogtied on the bedroom floor, but there was no sign of Crazy Eyes Craig. The police freed the mother and daughter before conducting a search of the entire house. They combed the place from top to bottom, but couldn't find any traces of Craig. It was as if he had vanished into the night. In fact, nobody had any idea where Craig was, and while he was still at large, no one in the town could rest easy. The incident was a huge shock for our small town. Before that, it had been a peaceful, idyllic little place. Nobody ever locked their doors. That night, I watched my father screwing 2 sturdy deadbolts onto our front and back doors. On Monday morning, it was the talk of the school. None of the kids could believe what had happened, and everyone was terrified. At the back of the school building, there was a huge forest, and rumors spread among the kids that Craig was hiding out in the woods, laying in wait for more victims. Some kids were even too scared to show up for class. Leanne and her family stayed with relatives for a few days to get away from the house. In all that time, law enforcement combed the woods and searched house to house, but nobody could find the crazy-eyed maniac. Eventually, Leanne and her family had to go home. As soon as they pulled into their driveway, they saw something that terrified them. Craig was standing at the top of an upstairs window, gazing out at them with a smirk on his face. The girl's father started yelling. The neighbors came running over. The police were called, and within minutes they were surrounding the house. A SWAT team were readying themselves beside a van, loading their weapons and studying the layout of the house. They searched the house from top to bottom, but they didn't find Craig anywhere. Instead, they were confronted by a disturbing scene. Pennies were glued to the ceiling, and there was strange writing all over the walls. All of their clothes had been cut into ribbons, and the entire contents of the kitchen fridge was neatly arranged on the living room floor, and the whole place reeked of urine and feces. The police conducted another thorough search of the house, but it turned up nothing. Just when they were about to give up and go home, one of the cops mentioned that he thought he heard a faint noise when he was in the basement. Sounded like it was coming from behind the washing machine. The SWAT team immediately recognized and descended cautiously into the basement. With their guns drawn, they pulled the washing machine away from the wall, and curled up in a hole behind it, they found Craig. As it turned out, the truth was much more disturbing than anyone had imagined. Leanne and her family were horrified. For 2 whole years, Craig had been living in their walls. They found peepholes everywhere. While Leanne and her family had been sitting at home, watching TV, eating dinner, taking showers, getting dressed, going to the washroom, and sleeping peacefully in their beds, Craig had been there the entire time, silently watching them with his crazy, bugged-out eyes.
This is a story about an old couple who lived together in a little house on the edge of town. They had been married for so long that they knew everything about each other. They knew each other so well that they even finished each other's sentences. One day, the old woman fell ill, and her husband spent every day by her bedside trying to nurse her back to health. Unfortunately, the old woman passed away, and her husband was devastated by the loss. She was his one true love. Soon afterwards, the doctor arrived and pronounced her dead. Because it was the middle of summer, they had a small funeral service and buried her the next day. The old man was so grief-stricken that, as his wife's coffin was being lowered into the grave, he tried to jump in after her. The people at the funeral had to hold him back until the grave was filled in. Lonely and miserable, the old man returned to his empty house. That night, he was awakened by a strange scratching sound. It grew louder and louder, but he couldn't figure out where it was coming from. When he turned over in bed, he was met with a terrifying sight. He saw a figure of a woman standing outside his bedroom window. With horror, he realized it was his wife. Her eyes were sunken and hollow. Her mouth was open wide in a silent scream, and her fingers were clawing at the window pane. When he ran to the window and opened it, the figure vanished into thin air. He phoned the doctor immediately and begged to have his wife's body exhumed from the grave. The doctor refused to allow the coffin to be dug up, telling the old man that he was just suffering from stress after his wife's death. But the old man continued to see the same ghostly apparition outside his window every night. Finally, the old man couldn't stand it anymore. He got out of bed, got dressed, grabbed a shovel and headed for the graveyard. He came to his wife's grave and began digging and digging. When he eventually unearthed his wife's coffin and pried open the lid, he recoiled in horror. His wife's mouth was wide open, frozen in a silent scream. There were scratch marks all over the inside of the coffin lid, and her fingers were worn down to the bone.
I have been dead for 145 years. A story written by MMKR2. I remember the date better than anyone else, for this day was the day I met my demise. It was seemingly average to most, with the exclusion of a few, but to me, it was what changed my world and my perception of time. August 14th, 1874. I was the owner of a farm down south, a farm that made my wife and I's living. It was rather small, but it was enough. The days would be long and filled with labor, but it was home. Later, in our young marriage, my wife Mary and I had our first child. His name was Robert, to which we called him Rob. He was an intelligent young boy, showing a high potential in life at such a young age. He grew to be a strong boy, to the age of 10, when this story takes place. My farm was old, and the buildings were dilapidated, for we had little money to spend other than for our living expenses. Bucket in hand, I started across the farm and to the cows, happily whistling an old tune. My heart rattled when I heard a creak. The silo above me was an eyesore, being one of the oldest buildings that still stood, and it was starting to give out. I made a note of it in my mind and continued down the dirt path and into the barn ahead. I tensed when I caught sight of Rob standing in front of the barn, awaiting me. "What are you doing out here, son?" I asked as I approached him. I opened the barn and started towards one of the cows. "Why, I was just walking around when I saw you skipping over." He let out a small laugh. My face reddened at the slightest. "I oughta put you in your place for saying that," I remarked. Rob darted out of the barn like a bullet and ran to the neighboring buildings. I dropped the bucket and started after him. I heard the creaking louden, and sure enough, Rob was running in the silo's direction. I sprinted as fast as I could, but Rob was no easy kid to catch. I could hear him let out a playful laugh when I suddenly heard the roof give in. The top piece was raining down from the sky, casting a shadow over me. I was running faster than a grasshopper, so it'd be no easy task to stop before the roof hit the ground. Luckily, Rob has already passed it and crashed to the ground out of breath. My shoes skid the ground, making dust fly, but I had drifted too far into the range. The million-ton piece had hit the ground, making my dust cloud seem like a cigarette smoke compared to the full cloud. My vision went dark. I didn't feel anything from the fall, strangely enough. So I brushed myself off and headed out of the ruins. What an anomaly, I thought to myself as I ran out to tell Rob about my lack of injury. "You're in a lot of trouble for letting me near my death like that," I jokingly yelled. Rob's expression didn't follow through with my comment though, like he hadn't heard me. Instead, he stared with the color drained from his face. I approached him, this time right near him. "Son!" I yelled. He was ignoring me, I thought. Rob ran in the direction of the house. I followed close behind, not feeling anything other than the wind. At the front of the porch stairs, Rob had broken down like the silo and collapsed to the ground, head and arms sobbing. I sat on the stairs next to him and put my hand on his shoulder. As I reached, my hand went straight through him. My heart stopped, and my brain went numb. Mary had walked out of the house and straight through me as she saw the fallen silo top. "It's horrible. Dad got crushed," Rob cried out. Mary's eyes teared up. "Don't move out of this house, you hear? Get inside and make yourself comfortable," Mary said. "Hello?" I yelled. Neither of them had heard me. Mary ran to the ruins. I followed, jumping off the stairs. My eyes widened as I realized I was still at the level of the stairs, flying. By concentration, I was able to move at an incredible speed. I passed Mary in a second and headed to the pile. I froze as I saw below the rubble was a large puddle of blood. It came true to me, all those legends and stories, for I had turned into none other than a ghost. The following days were heavy. I had no desire to eat or drink anymore, but my heart throbbed for love. I saw my own funeral where my family cried themselves to the next day. I didn't feel tired, but I sure wanted to rest all this emotion off. So I fell asleep in my barn. When I awoke, the walls of our bedroom had chipped and a musty smell hit me. I started out into the hallway, where it looked worn. I went to Rob's room to check on him, but his room was nothing more than empty. Startled, I went down the stairs to greet Mary, even though she couldn't hear me. I shook as I saw the wrinkles on her face. She was by the fireplace knitting. I saw a calendar on the mantel, and I read it to see January 12th, 1890. Had I slept 26 years? I went out into the farm, which looked rather healthy. Even in the winter, I saw a man approach me, followed by a woman. I yelled at Mary at the top of my voice, warning her of the strange visitors. Alas, she didn't hear me. The man walked in. "The animals are healthy and taken care of, Ma," he said. Why is he calling my wife his mother? I suddenly came to the realization that this was Rob, and the woman following him was his wife. I wish Pops was still around. Oh, how I miss him dearly. He'd be proud of my work here, he said delicately. A tear formed in my eye. I wanted to tell him that I was still here, but they would never be able to hear me. I knew that I didn't want to be here anymore. I closed my eyes and drifted off to sleep. I awoke to darkness. The musty smell was very clear now. The floorboards were broken. The wall paint was nearly gone, and the items in the house were gone too. My heart raced. I flew out of the house and onto the field, where all the buildings were covered in ivy. I smelled something strange, yet satisfying to my nose. I flew up ahead, where I saw a large strip of hard gray rock. Moving objects with wheels raced by incredibly fast. I followed the strip endlessly, until I came across a town with the objects all over it. Where was Mary? Where was Rob? I looked up at the church, where the sign read, August 14th, 1919. I had been gone for 45 years. I wanted to see Rob more than anything right now. Perhaps now I could finally talk to him? As my desire grew, I was brought to him. My body flew for what seemed like forever at top speed, until I came upon his house. Inside was an old man and his wife. The old man was pouring himself a glass of tea, and the woman was knitting by the fire, just as Mary did at 1890. I kept trying to reach for objects to get their attention, but my hand went through everything. A knocking shook the door. The woman opened the door to reveal two small children. They must have been Rob's grandchildren, which means Mary must have passed away by now. As they greeted each other, I closed my eyes, wanting to get out of this place as fast as I could. I awoke in the house, but I quickly flew out onto the street, where objects were everywhere. I found the church, which looked brand new. The clock read June 11th, 1955. On the gray strip was where several more objects passed, this time a dark green. There were a bunch of soldiers on the top of it, with the strangest uniforms I've ever seen. This time, I wanted to learn about the future. I wanted to know what all this was, so I stayed around the city for a long time. It was not until a year after that I knew what cars and roads were, and that telephones were these magical devices that allow you to talk to somebody from far away. A TV was a machine that allowed you a window into other people's lives. It was all so stunning to me. Here I was, still in my overalls, while everybody else wore suits and ties. It was 1956 when I decided to finally go into the house. There were a few adults and kids there, all of which I didn't know. I knew for certain that Rob was dead, and his kids had become old, and his kids' kids had become old. By this time, I figured my great-grandchildren were alive. It haunted me, but I wanted to go ahead. I closed my eyes and drifted to sleep. I awoke to hear the sound of cars everywhere. I flew out of the house to see the roads and buildings, which were much taller. People were walking all around the streets, some holding an object up to their ear and talking. This, my friends, is the time I am in now. The clock read July 16th, 2012. People were tapping these rectangles. The cars that passed were nearly silent, and the buildings were glassy. And so, just as I did in 1955, I learned what smartphones were, in the world of technology and computers. I learned until my mind was filled with this new era of life. It was January of 2019 when I finally realized all there was. It took me years to learn, and I was now completely familiar. By this time, I visited my family and saw that I was a great-grandfather since my children had children young. It was a normal day when all of a sudden I was able to successfully grab something. That something is the phone I am using right now. I wanted others to know about my adventure through time, and how it was to learn of your children's children. After typing as far as I did, I had heard a voice. This voice was to me. After all this time, all of these eras, someone had finally reached me. Even when learning, I had pains and suffered the misery of no communication. It was a hard life, but I had gotten used to it. I knew I would always miss my child and wife, but I had come to accept that. This voice lit a spark in my brain that hadn't been lit in 145 years. I listened to what it said. It offered me my life in 1874 at the cost of me remembering all I do now, and the fact that nobody would believe me if I were to say anything about these times. I thought carefully and realized that I had no future here. As soon as I hit post, I will finally be transported back to my time, where I will live the rest of my years as if nothing had happened. The voice said that I would stop just before the silo hit the ground. Thank you for listening. Best of luck to you all in this time.
This story is taken from a letter written but never sent, found in the personal effects of a Revolutionary War soldier, dated July 19th, 1779. I shouldn't be alive. The slight ripples in my handwriting have probably given away my current state of mind. The quill shakes, and no amount of drink can steady me. The events of the past few days sit in my thoughts like the murky waters of the marsh we left behind days ago. This event happened. Of this I am certain, for I'm still here to tell a tale. Nevertheless, it remains unbelievable to me. I hope in writing this down, it will be more real. But I think one day, I shall die still not believing. The General awakened us early on July 15th. We were ordered to shave and powder, rallying our spirits for the new day. We were then told to sharpen our bayonets, but to leave the flint from our muskets. A very odd request, but one I knew well. A few years back, we had had an unfortunate encounter with a British general named Grey. He had attacked us during the night. No musket fire, just bayonets slicing through men as they slept. The few of us who had the fortune to stay together through these past few years gave knowing glances. Were we about to do the same? Only the general knew exactly where we were going, but our faith in him had never wavered, and this day was no different. We marched, single file, through winding mountain trails, rocky and steep, the heat adding some strain to our secret journey. As dusk fell, we reached our destination, an isolated farm. We barely had time to rest when my officer announced what the night would hold for us. At midnight, we were to storm Stony Point, a position on the Hudson taken from us by the British. Perhaps it was because we were the elite, the chosen ones, hardened by months of fighting. But none of us seemed to be surprised or shaken by these orders. I felt my own jaw clench in determined resolve. It wasn't going to be easy. Perhaps the madness of our dear general had whittled its way into our own veins. We would gleefully march into hell as long as he was at the helm. The plan was precise. We would be broken into parts, 2 secret regiments on either side of the target. Nothing but bayonets to shield them, and a third in the center who would draw all the enemy fire while the others creeped through the marsh. We would kill the British in soundless surprise. The 2 clandestine regiments required something else, though. The Forlorn Hope, volunteers who would rush ahead of the vanguard using only heavy axes. They would cut through the abatis, allowing the vanguards to slip through easily. I can't tell you what made me volunteer for such a suicidal mission, but I did. Almost as soon as I offered my life to the cause, I saw a familiar face doing the same. Edward, the only friend I had managed to procure. He had taken a bayonet to the chest during the Battle of Paoli. Camaraderie has always been difficult for me, more so when death is faced on an almost daily basis. The names mean nothing anymore, just faces to recognize as corpses. Many volunteers were turned away, but Edward and I were chosen and fell under the command of Lieutenant Gibbons, a stalwart man from Pennsylvania. A half hour before the battle was to begin, we, the Forlorn Hope, were given our only weapon, a heavy axe. The weight of it poured into my hand as if it were always meant to be mine. Edward and I drank our ration of rum, not saying a word. What was there to say? Our chances of surviving this night were slim. So what would 2 dead men need to discuss? We were signaled to begin our journey into battle when I felt a hand on my shoulder. Edward looked into my eyes and whispered, "I'll have your back until we meet again." He winked at me, flashing a devilish grin, a trait that had won him so many friends in the regiment. We readied ourselves for the attack. Were given a final admonishment to keep as silent as possible, and we trudged through the marshy waters surrounding the point. We made our way into hell. We lumbered through the mud, water up to our knees, being careful not to make a sound. A gust of wind carried across the land, and I thought I could make out a few flickering lights dancing on the surface of the marsh. Old tales from a homeland I barely knew flipped through my head. Would we be betrayed by fairy folk this night? Would the banshee wail for me? I stiffened up and caught myself from allowing my thoughts to wander so darkly. I had a job to do. Behind me marched the vanguard, 150 strong, bayonets at the ready. I clenched my axe a bit tighter. I would break through the abattis so the vanguards could sink their teeth into the British. We were silent, but the British caught on to the movements of the men on the right flank and opened fire. We had reached our position just minutes before, and a few of us had already been hacking away at the abattis. Between the bites of my own axe, I heard the screams of men as the right flank came under heavier fire. With an explosion of splintering wood, musket balls hit the abattis in front of me, splintering into toothpicks that needled into my cheek. We had been detected, and now all the fire was trained on us. I heard muskets behind me. This was the diversionary third column from North Carolina. But it was too late for us. Bodies fell around me as I kept hacking. We were dying. I was knocked to the wet muck as a fellow forlorn was hit by a killing blow. I tried to get up and out from under the corpse, but a firm hand slammed me back, pushed me back down into the mud. At first I was angry, but the musket fire that screamed over my head made me realize I was being pushed down for my own safety. That same hand grabbed the back of my shirt and lurched me up. I turned for a split second to see Edward grinning. We had done it. We had broken through and the vanguard spilled into the enemy. I erupted through the breach and took aim at the first redcoat I could embed my axe into. Blood showered out of the wound and I shoved him to the ground. I continued to hack and slash through flesh and uniform. Again, a hand on my back shoved me out of the way as a redcoat made a lunge from the darkness. His bayonet missed, but I didn't, chopping his hand off and laying my axe into his face. It went on like this. Edward at my back, guiding me through the fray. Internally, the battle seemed to last for hours. I only stopped when Gibbons approached, looking at me as though I'd gone insane. I let the axe fall to my side and surveyed the area. A dead man lay at my feet, his face nothing but meat and bone. Bodies littered the readout. I only knew later that our entire struggle took less than an hour. We gathered ourselves in the darkness, the smell of blood and iron wafting in the night air. I looked for Edward, but I couldn't find him. I grabbed one of the forlorn that had made it through with me, a young blonde kid with muscles larger than he would have thought. "Where are the rest?" I asked him. "Just you, me, and him." He tilted his head in the direction of another man whose name I hadn't cared to know. "Where's Edward?" I asked him. He looked at me and shook his head. "Edward?" he said in confusion. I didn't have time to question him further. Gibbons made his way over to us. "You men have done an amazing thing tonight," he said. "Our forlorn took the greatest casualties. Only the three of you and myself are left." Looking back and forth between the other two survivors, I asked, "Where is Edward's body?" Gibbons glared at me in anger and exasperation for a moment. And then his face took on an altogether different shape. One of concern and pity. The air around me turned cold, and I knew exactly what the lieutenant was going to say. Words I remembered him saying to me before, but words that always seemed to leave me. William, you know where Edward's body is. Long buried in Paoli. Till the next time we meet, I suppose.
Sitting on my armchair, I look at the clock and see that it's 5 minutes to 11. 5 minutes to go for the part of the day I look forward to the most. Exactly at 11, my husband will read out my daughter's favorite bedtime story as she gets ready to go to sleep. We have been a busy couple, and my husband particularly had been a workaholic, working almost 16 hours a day. He didn't really have time for our daughter or me. The time he would spend at home would be the time he was sleeping. I had learned to live with it in these 10 years, but our daughter Mariah always wanted her father to be with her. I tried to make her understand that her daddy had important work to do. He needed to be out there. He worked so hard for us only. But there's hardly any reason a 5-year-old will understand. I would tell all this to my husband when he came back home, and he would laugh it out. "I'll make it up for later, honey, I promise," he used to say. I promise, I promise, I promise. But promises don't mean much anymore now, do they? I expected that some things would change after my daughter fell ill, though. I had to run around with her, taking her to different hospitals and doctors for treatment, but none of the doctors could give any hope. They said that it was a lost case. As I would give her the medicines, Mariah would only ask one question to me. "Where's Daddy?" And I never had an answer. But my husband's working hours seemed to increase quite in contrast to what I had expected. He used to spend many nights outside the house, and when he was here, he would act distant. We had already stopped sleeping in the same room, and then we rarely talked. Not anymore, though. I remember the time Mariah was in the hospital. Every time I would visit, she would only ask where her daddy was, and I never knew the answer. I would assure her that Daddy would come, but deep inside, I knew that he was way too busy to even bother about his own daughter. I slowly get up and walk up the stairs to my daughter's room. As I slowly open the door, I see them in the dim light of the night lamp. The room is completely dark, and all the windows are closed and curtains are drawn. There's a stuffy, pungent smell in the room. I go and switch on the tape recorder. The husky voice of my husband slowly fills the room, as his mechanical voice starts narrating the bedtime story. I gently caress my daughter's face. It is cold. I hold my husband's hand. It is cold too. I gently whisper into his ear. "Now you make up for it."
Nobody remembers the number between 3 and 4. Written by Rokai140. What can you do when you remain the last herald of a universal truth that seems to have been erased for no apparent reason? From infancy, people are taught basic concepts such as the succession of numbers, something that is merely a sequence of words, pronounced different in each language. A mathematical axiom created to make sure people understand each other when talking about numbers. It is taken for granted. It remains unchanged for thousands of years. And yet, you wake up one day to find out that suddenly, everyone follows a new sequence now. Nobody remembers the number that comes between 3 and 4. Nobody but me, of course. It would be difficult to identify the exact time when it happened. In the movie Groundhog Day, Bill Murray lives out his day normally at first, until he slowly realizes that the same day would keep repeating itself. Similarly, I too had no idea that my concept of how to count to 10 got somehow misaligned from the rest of the world's. A few misunderstandings with colleagues, cashiers, all with their weird looks simply making me feel embarrassed. I had probably just been too tired, so I never spoke up when I got corrected. But slowly, all these little mistakes added up in the back of my head. Why do I keep getting my numbers wrong? It felt as if I had suddenly become dumb. 2 college degrees, yet unable to do simple additions. No, it can't be right. I took to textbooks and online resources, hoping it would discredit my detractors. But instead, I got a slap in the face from what is now the accepted truth. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. I had either been wrong my entire life, or something somehow changed. But how would a condemnation of this grand scale be possible? And better yet, who would have the power and instruments to conduct it? At first, I kept this to myself. Didn't want to seem like a schizo. After all, the math in this new reality did work out. Everyone is able to calculate correctly. From a utilitarian standpoint, it matters little whether the number after 3 is called 4 or something else. But then comes the question of, why would someone change it? Even accepting a global conspiracy of this caliber, one has to look for a reason behind it. Every lunatic with a tinfoil hat is able to justify their half-baked ideas. Big corporations want to profit off of you, or the government wants to control you. I guess it is fairly easy to make someone forget an arbitrary concept like a number. If one were to invent a machine that has the capacity to wipe certain memories or pieces of knowledge from humanity's collective consciousness, testing it out on a number would be fairly easy. But if this really is a kind of beta test for an Illuminati-esque brainwashing exercise, then I fear for what the end purpose of it all is. And more importantly, why am I the only one left out? Could it be an inexplicable immunity to the technology used? A glitch in the system? Or perhaps this is all a cruel experiment intended to torture and alienate me, a completely average, insignificant person. I have now learned to live like everyone else, step in line and pretend that the Emperor has clothes on. I am accustomed to this new system that everyone seems to be happy with. I also seem happy. I have to be, otherwise I fear for what may happen to me if the truth reveals itself. That whatever was supposed to happen to every single being on Earth did not happen to me. But to remind myself of the truth, I wake up every morning and repeat the same thing to myself. 1, 2, 3, 4.
September 20th, 1944. Dear Mom, everyone says the war's ending soon. I don't know. We dropped into the Netherlands just yesterday. Those 24 hours seemed like an entire century. I write this letter to you in hopes that I can get this out to someone. Anyone. The Germans have built these things called concentration camps. We don't know the exact reasons yet, but they haul all these Jews, God rest their souls, to these camps and, well, I don't know, they kill them, I guess. We found one of those yesterday. I remember it all so clearly. Jeremy and I were the first ones out of the plane. We were dropped above a cloud bank, so we couldn't see the ground until it was too late to maneuver around. Jeremy saw it first. A sprawling square of gray buildings. Gray everything. There were people on the ground walking in gray uniforms, and there was a bunch of gray watchtowers around. So I guess that's why Jeremy started screaming bloody murder, telling me that we were going to be killed by those krauts down there. I looked down and the first thing that hit me was how slow those guys in gray uniforms were walking around. They were more like shambling around. Actually, I didn't realize it until now. Almost all of them were standing still. They had already spotted us and slowly moved into a circle. Jeremy was screaming so loudly by now that I was wondering if his head was going to explode. I tried to calm him down, but most of my attention was focused on the ground below us. It was only a matter of seconds before we hit the ground, and Jeremy was trying to hug me. He was asking me to deliver something to his ma, tell his girl he loved her, all that stuff. I kept on telling him that everything was going to be okay, that the people down there were just prisoners of war, but I was distracted by the people in the gray suits down there. They were almost in a perfect circle now, just standing. What really got to me, though, was how they looked at us. At first glance, I thought they were looking at us as if we were food. The glint in their eyes, the special frown that they had. It was pity. Jeremy started crying the minute we hit the ground. I removed my gear and had to get his off too. It hit me that no one else dropped from our plane. It was no use getting the heavy paratrooper gear off of Jeremy. He just kept sobbing on the ground, saying that the crowds got us, and that he didn't sign up for this. It was just me and the prisoners. I looked at them, they looked back at me, and none of them had any weapons. So I guess they weren't in the middle of an insurrection or anything. There weren't any Nazi corpses lying about, but there was something I can recall very clearly. It was the smell of rotten flesh. "Hello?" I called to them. There was no response, only expressionless faces. This gave me the creeps, so I withdrew my pistol from its holster. What's going on? Jeremy whispered by my side. He'd gotten up and finally accepted the fact that we were surrounded by prisoners of war. I motioned for him to stop. Suddenly, I heard a ripping sound, and saw that a prisoner's arm had fallen off. What? Jeremy had barely a second to react before there were more of those noises coming from all around us. I swore that just a minute ago I saw human faces, human bodies, looking at me. Now I was staring into the face of death. There wasn't really any other way to explain it. The wind picked up, and the sky above had darkened considerably. And all the while, the question of why this was happening to the prisoners ran through my head. The answer was obvious. We were surrounded by standing corpses. I saw it now. The eyeballs were withered, dirty. The faces' features fell off one by one. Cheeks had holes in them, foreheads had bullet wounds. The only consistent thing about them were their clothes, the shade of gray. I tell you, if I ever see that shade again, I'll vomit. Jeremy had already begun running, but we were still surrounded. And even though the prisoners' bodies were falling apart, it seemed that they were slowly closing in on us. For the first time in my life, I could see the effects of time. Legs became femurs, and faces turned into skulls. In a few seconds, piles upon piles of bone and rotting flesh lay around us. Yet there was still one prisoner who remained. Even though his brethren had all died, he still stood there, ever so slightly shaking back and forth. His head was fixated on the ground, but I swear he snapped it up in a quarter of a second when I aimed my pistol at him. "Don't move!" I yelled. Jeremy was probably running for his life by now, but I wasn't able to leave with this guy on our tail. He had to be dealt with. He stared at me, his eyelids pulled back all the way. I fired a warning shot at his feet. He merely smiled and laughed. It was an ear-piercing sound, but he cocked up his head and laughed. I turned around and began running towards Jeremy. The laughs got worse, and I think I know why it sounded so bad. His larynx was deteriorating. There were plopping noises behind me as his limbs fell off. I don't really remember what happened after that. Jeremy and I met up at HQ an hour apart, and even though neither of us had a map, we made our way through a forest that took a jeep 4 hours to get through in 30 minutes. We found our squad leader, and he told us that we were missing during roll call during that morning. We told him our story, and he told us about the concentration camps. Of course, he didn't believe us, especially about certain parts of the story. How could a man rot in a matter of seconds? Perhaps more mysteriously, how did we end up in a place that could only be reached by paradropping out of a plane, when we weren't even in a plane? Nobody agreed to trek through the forest to find the concentration camp when we asked to go back there. Of course, in the end, Jeremy and I decided against it. Today we captured a village. I'd tell you what it's called, but I don't remember the name. We were lucky enough to surprise and capture all the German soldiers there without a fight. We even caught a high-ranking German officer. Our corpsman, Nate, took some German language classes when he was in university. Our squad leader told him to interrogate the officer about key defensive positions, the number of soldiers in the area, that kind of thing. I realized this could be the chance to find out about something. I told Nate to ask the officer about the concentration camps in the area. Nate took some time to describe the camps to the officer, since I doubt German classes teach you how to say concentration camp in German. The officer shook his head, saying that they cleared out the camps a month ago when they retreated to Germany.
This happened about 9 years ago. I was living with a roommate at the time. My boyfriend at the time had always been kind of abusive, with the occasional slap or pinning me down on the floor. But after a family member that he was close to committed suicide, he really lost it. My ex, Pierce, just lost it in the middle of an argument one day about a week after the funeral and threw me on the ground, punching my arm over and over until there was a giant bruise on one shoulder and a handprint-shaped bruise on the other. My face also ended up being swollen and I had a bloody lip. My roommate called the police and he ended up being arrested and a no-contact order was put in place. He was also ordered to go to counseling and maybe drug or alcohol meetings. Fast forward a few months, I'm living with this roommate because I was completely financially dependent on him. She's taken it upon herself to pay for me to get my GED. And a lot of my time was spent on studying for the subjects. After everything, I was very agoraphobic, but I even managed to forge some online friendships and maybe even something more with a genuinely kind guy. One day, Pierce's grandmother stopped by to take me to pay my phone bill. She lived close by in the same townhouse complex and was more or less right behind where I lived. I remember it being the first beautiful and slightly warm day after a long winter, so I opened all the blinds to let the sunlight in, and left them open when I left. After paying my phone bill, Pierce started calling her. I wasn't too concerned because I knew that he was supposed to be at his court-mandated counseling shortly. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but his grandmother told him that we had just stopped at McDonald's. Again, not an issue at this point. I continued to eat my Big Mac or whatever, until maybe 3 minutes later, Pierce calls again. His grandma tells him that she's probably going to be home in about 10 minutes. The call ends. I finish my food and we leave. Again, in the car as I'm maybe 2 minutes away from where I live, Pierce calls again. I still can't hear his side of the conversation, but his grandma tells him the intersection we just passed, and suddenly I have this terrible sinking feeling in my stomach. I know something is wrong, and I can't identify what exactly, but I know in my heart something is very wrong. I considered asking his grandma for help, but for context, his grandmother, on multiple occasions, watched Pierce hit me or try to strangle me, and openly expressed disgust at how I can't help but make him angry. This same lady that knew her daughter, Pierce's mother, broke Pierce's nose when he was 6 because he saw his mother flip someone off and copied her and did nothing to intervene to let her know that wasn't okay. The family member Pierce was mourning for often told him that he was messed up and was probably the most verbally and emotionally abusive person I've ever witnessed in real life or in a movie or whatever. So this family is just super messed up and abusive to other people, to each other. So I'm completely alone in this situation. Anyway, his grandma pulls in front of where I live and I notice all of the blinds I had opened are now closed. We go inside, and once she leaves, I walk upstairs to my room and see a random Word document open on my computer. Pierce has written a whole page, but I only pay attention to the big words at the top. I read your emails. Immediately, I know that he's seen the emails between me and the guy I had met. Even though they weren't outright sexual or flirty, you could kind of tell there was something there. My brain stopped reading at this point, and I needed to figure out if he's still in this building. Because there's a no contact order, I know he could have come in through the back door so nobody would see him. So my mind quickly turns into this idea that if the back door is locked, he's probably gone. I run downstairs to the door and see that it's locked. But as soon as I reach the door, I hear a closet sliding open from the room I was just in. Loud and angry footsteps, and he's yelling my name. I know that this may sound weird, but I can't recall exact details. I remember his face in mind before I could understand what was happening. I remember being back up in that room again. I think to go through all of my emails with him, and I remember him slapping me hard in the face until I got dizzy. I remember somehow convincing him to let me use my phone to respond to one of my roommate's texts. I don't remember what I said, but I remember that she called right away. I remember Pierce standing 2 feet away from me and looking at me, believing he was going to kill me, and my roommate asking me, "Are you safe?" I only said, "No." She told me that she was on her way and would be there as fast as she could. Eventually, Pierce became convinced that I had called the police, and with a knife in his hands, told me that if they were coming anyway, that he might as well give me what I deserve. I managed to convince him that I didn't call the police, and then he started crying about what a terrible person he was and threatened to kill himself with that knife. So, with a handprint on my swollen face, I tried to convince him that he wasn't a terrible person and not to kill himself until my roommate came home. Insane ex-boyfriend, I moved states, had my name changed, and only feel safe in buildings in big cities. Let's not ever meet again.
You are my sunshine, my only sunshine. You make me happy when skies are gray. You never know, dear, how much I love you. Please don't take my sunshine away. Mommy always sang this to me when I was younger. It helped me to forget things that Daddy did to Mommy and to Johnny. Daddy was always angry at our home. He would come home from work and start throwing things at Mommy. It got loud, and I hid under the table every time Daddy would shout at Mommy until Johnny got Daddy to leave. Johnny was Mommy's boyfriend, but treated me like I was a princess. I always got to play with the newest dolls, and he always took me to the carnival and always drove me to school. Johnny cared for me like he did Mommy, but Daddy was always mean to Mommy. Daddy would come in the house and yell at Mommy. He was always there yelling at Mommy to give me Tanya back. I never wanted to go with Daddy, and he would try to fight with Mommy and Johnny, and Daddy would argue outside and fight all the time. Daddy would hit Johnny, and Johnny would drive Daddy away. They always fought, and there was never happiness between them. Pain. Daddy would go away for a while, then come back later. He and Mommy would never stop arguing, and Daddy tried to take me with him. Daddy said I was in danger if I stayed home, but Mommy wouldn't let him take me. His words scared me. He said that people were getting sick, but Johnny told him it was all a bunch of lies and told him to leave. Mommy kept taking me to school and made sure to bring me home. Daddy would wait for me out by the school and offer to drop me off, but Mommy told me not to go with him. I obeyed Mommy and got in the car with her. Every day I went to school, and there would be less of my friends going. Nobody was going to school but me. Mommy told me they were not going to class and that they'd be in big trouble with their parents at home for not going. She said she was proud of me for doing my homework and still going to school. I didn't want to disappoint Mommy, so I kept going to school, but weird things started happening. My friends stopped going to school, and a lot of the kids were gone. My teacher left sick, and only me and someone else was learning from the substitute teacher. The other kid left and never came back either, and I couldn't go to school anymore. Sickness. Mommy was upset that I couldn't keep going to school and told me to read my book and write down notes like in class. I didn't want to disappoint Mommy, so I kept writing in my journal. I had written down everything new I learned and made sure to write all of it down. Daddy would still come sometimes and try to take me from her. He said that, "You're endangering her, Rachel. She can't stay here anymore." But as soon as Daddy came to talk to Mommy, Johnny made Daddy leave. Daddy and Johnny were always fighting. Johnny kept telling Daddy that we were fine and that he didn't need to worry, but Daddy never left. Daddy came back every day trying to take me with him. I love Daddy, but he is wrong. I'm Mommy's little sunshine, and I belong to her. She tells me how I make every day better for her and that I mean the world to her. But Mommy became worried when Johnny helped a man outside who needed help. Mommy tried to save him, but he was gone before Mommy could help. Cold. Autumn arrived and both Mommy and Johnny made Halloween decorations. I helped carve pumpkins and helped Mommy make some pumpkin pies. Daddy came again and started smashing the decorations. Johnny and Daddy started fighting outside, and Johnny hurt Daddy's face. I cried to Mommy for Johnny to stop, but Johnny kept hitting him. He kept hitting him and hitting him. Mommy went outside and tried to stop Johnny, but Johnny told her to go inside and couldn't stop him. Johnny kept stomping on Daddy's face, making him turn red. Daddy didn't wake up after the fight, and Johnny moved Daddy to the backyard and put him in the bushes. He told me and Mommy not to talk about what happened and not to visit Daddy. I wanted to see Daddy, but Mommy told me not to. I didn't want to disappoint Mommy, so I didn't go see Daddy. Mommy didn't have to tell me that Daddy was gone, and Johnny made Daddy go, but I couldn't help Daddy. Mommy told me to keep writing everything in my journal, so I wrote about how I missed Daddy. Daddy was mean and yelled a lot, but he was still my daddy and I missed him. I wanted Daddy back, but he was gone and he won't come back. Death. Johnny started getting sick. Mommy tried to get him medicine, but they ran out. All the stores were closed and no kids were outside. No one was playing, no cars went by, and no noises were outside. The TV stopped working and Mommy was making smaller lunches and dinners. She told me we need to watch what we eat. I listened to Mommy and only ate what she gave me. Johnny didn't leave his bed for a week, and one day Mommy woke up and said he was cold. Mommy was in tears and I tried to cheer her up. She smiled and hugged me. "You will always be my little sunshine, Tanya." Mommy started to get sick too. I tried to help Mommy get better. I gave her food, but she told me not to. She told me that she would get better if I just brought her water. I didn't want to disappoint Mommy, so I did as she told me. She would sing to me at night that song I liked. You are my sunshine, my only sunshine. You make me happy when skies are gray. You never know, dear, how much I love you. Please don't take my sunshine away. Mommy kept getting sick and told me one night before falling asleep, you will always be my sunshine. I woke up the next morning and found Mommy. She was cold, and when I shook her, she didn't wake up. Mommy was gone, and so was the food. I ate what was left, but I kept getting hungry. No one was outside, and I was too scared to go outside. Mommy, I'm so sorry I disappointed you. I was just so hungry that I had to. Mommy was so tasty, and the red that came out tasted so good. The hunger went away the more I ate, and Mommy still smiled at me. I got Mommy's heart out, and I took a bite. I ate it all. I feel like I was bad, but I was just so hungry. But I'm still Mommy's little sunshine, right?
When I was 4, I killed my first ant. It didn't have a name. Of that, I was absolutely certain. My own name isn't important to you right now, although it's likely you'll learn some version of it soon. I think you'll end up learning a lot about me in the coming days. Some will be true, but most will be false. There is a crucial element that will be missed, simply because it's unknowable to anyone else. Anyone but me. But I am going to share it with you. At the age of 19, as a soldier, I killed my first person. He had a name. Of that too, I was absolutely certain. And he changed me. My act of violence led me to learn who he was and what he meant to others. And at the same time, I learned something essential about myself, something I was unprepared for. I recoiled in profound, uncomprehending terror. Today, I work in a hospice. No one there knows what I've done. No one there knows who I really am. They think I'm there to work, which is technically true. But I have more tasks than those given to me by my supervisors. One particular task, one I've prepared for and dreamed about, is to be done today. Today is when I learn whether or not I'm going to die. Today is my 522nd birthday. Believe it, don't believe it, it doesn't matter to me. When I killed my first person at the age of 19, I did more than take his life. I assumed parts of him. He was a left-handed blacksmith's apprentice named Pierre Gaultier. The moment he breathed his final breath, my left hand lost its sinister clumsiness. I instantaneously understood the basics of metalworking, and I learned his name. I felt his name. It was as familiar to me as my own. It was the most horrifying moment of my life, the most disorienting, and that night, using my newly dexterous left hand, I tried to cut my own throat. The blade passed over my skin as if it were iron. I later hanged myself from a beam in an abandoned abbey, only to dangle uselessly for 3 days before I was found and cut down by a local derelict. I begged him to help me take my life, but I didn't have enough money to make it worth his while. When I killed him in a rage of frightened and confused desperation, I absorbed his alcoholism. The following centuries were a haze of blood and drink. I've absorbed countless talents, countless traits, countless vices. But the names aren't countless. There are 7,339 names inside me now. 7,339 clusters of memories to haunt me. This all leads to today. For 500 years, I've stayed under the radar. I've hidden in the shadows and killed, hoping to absorb any knowledge someone might have of another man like me, another man who shares my curse. But I'm unique. No one is like me. Every open throat and subsequent transfer of name and ability has yielded nothing useful. Nothing useful, that is, until last month. He was a man called Gustav Brennerson, and along with his name, he transferred to me his influenza. It was the first time I've ever been sick. The hospice here has 44 beds. 41 are filled. 41 opportunities. I dream of names and cancer every night while I'm taunted by the false death of sleep. Tonight, wherever it is I lay my head, as it seethes with 41 new names, I pray it seethes with something new, something malignant, something terminal, something that will end these centuries of hideous wandering. I dream of being eaten alive.
In the earliest months of 2014, I started dating my current boyfriend. We hit it off immediately, which resulted in me staying at his house multiple nights out of the week. Eventually, I ended up living there, sharing a mobile home with him and his father. The neighborhood itself was fairly creepy, one of those unnamed country areas that branched from a main road. Richard, my boyfriend's dad, would tell me stories about how the entire street was owned by one man, a guy who had gotten old in recent years and let the land go. As a result, a field beside the mobile home was overgrown with weeds and old trees. He also told me about strange occurrences which he attributed to two things: aliens and kids from another neighborhood. Despite his warnings and how creepy the area was, I didn't take him too seriously. After all, his biggest concern was aliens. I was unemployed for a short period of time after moving in, which left me alone in the house while Cody, my boyfriend, and his dad went to work. I spent most of my days putting in job applications, cleaning up the house, and reading online. I guess you could say that my presence at the house was pretty predictable, which is the only explanation for this occurrence. On a day as unremarkable as any, while I sat reading a book in our bedroom, I heard a car pull into the driveway. The sound was pretty distinctive considering the area wasn't paved but rather made up of gravel. Thinking that Cody had come home early from work, I slipped on some shoes and started for the front door, which was on the other side of the house. Before I could reach it, a knock sounded against the glass. The front of our trailer had a sunroom, basically a front porch that is encased with windows, making it so that you had to go through 2 doors before stepping into the living room. Being as paranoid as he was, Richard would usually lock the sunroom door before leaving for work unless he was in a huge hurry. Still thinking that maybe my boyfriend had come home early from work, I opened the front door to let him in. Only it wasn't Cody at the door, but rather a short Hispanic man. He smiled at me through the glass and nodded, almost as if I was exactly who he was expecting to answer. I noticed that he had one of his hands behind his back, the other hanging at his side. I tried not to think too much about it. Behind him in our carport was a small white truck, and I could hear that the engine was still running. "Can I help you?" I tried to make my voice sound strong, but it only came out as shaky. I'm with the garbage company. I'm here to pick up your trash cans. I blinked, knowing immediately that this was a lie. Yes, it was common for the garbage company to pick up the trash cans if the bill hadn't been paid, but I had gone with Cody the week before to pay it. Not to mention the drivers would never knock on the doors, they would just take the cans and leave. I glanced to my left, seeing that our cans were still there, where we always kept them. On the outside of the sunroom, somewhat behind the house. They're right there. If you need them, then take them. This time my voice was more assertive, causing my visitor's smile to turn into a frown. "Can I come in?" he asked. I didn't verbally answer. I just shook my head. My heart dropped as I watched him reach up and grab the door handle to the glass door, pulling on it to open it. The door clicked, obviously locked. The man tried to pull it again, this time harder, causing the metal to creak. I jumped back into the house and slammed the front door, locking it with purpose. It was so quiet in the house that I only noticed two sounds, my heart pounding, and the doorknob to our back door jiggling. There's no way it could have been the guy on the front porch. He wouldn't have had enough time to get to the back door, even if he ran. "I'm calling the fucking police," I yelled through the door, still baffled at the fact that this was all happening in broad daylight. I could hear the truck drive through the carport into our backyard immediately after that. I took a moment to look through the blinds of a window, watching as a separate man jumped off the back porch and into the passenger seat. To this day, I'm convinced these men knew I was home alone and clearly planned an attack. One of them was meant to distract me while the other broke into the back door. I still don't know what the front door guy had behind his back. All I can say is I am forever thankful on how paranoid my father-in-law is. Who knows what would have happened if he hadn't locked the sunroom door.
In the basement. I'm pretty sure our basement is haunted or something. Actually, I know it is haunted. My family and I moved into this house about a month ago. The rent was cheap, and we really weren't in a position to say no or to be too picky. The price of housing has jumped considerably in the local area. It is a 4-bedroom place in the not-so-great part of town. It has a basement, a shitty attic, and the owners lived overseas. They left everything to the rental company. It seemed like they didn't want anything to do with the house itself, but for some reason, they couldn't part with it. At least, that's what it sounded like. We thought it was fantastic. There is nothing worse than a nosy landlord. My parents would take the master bedroom. My grandparents would take the second largest. And my 2 siblings took the other bedrooms. I got the basement, and I was excited for it at first. It was huge, and I would have it all to myself. I was beginning to unpack when I heard a bump. I stopped and looked around. Nothing. I figured it was one of my siblings playing some kind of prank on me. I rolled my eyes, smiled to myself, and began to place my books on the bookshelf. My phone rang. I got up and looked at the number. Private number. So I ignored it, dropped it back on the bed, and turned around. Pick up. Pick up. Pick up. I thought I heard someone talking. Dana? I asked in hopes of hearing my sister's voice. I saw a shadow in the corner of the room. Child size. About her height. There was no one else it could have been. I sighed irritably. Dana, you're getting too old to play those games. I need to get unpacked. Why don't you come and help me? She didn't say anything. My normally incredibly chatty sister was silent. It was extremely strange. Dana, stop being a weirdo and get away from the corner. No one has time for this bullshit. I'm not in the corner. Dana's voice called out from the bottom of the stairs, her green eyes wide in confusion, a glass of orange juice in either of her hands. If she was here, then who was in the corner? I looked back towards the corner and the shadow was gone. Maybe it was my imagination playing tricks on me. I smiled at Dana and gestured with her hand for her to come and sit with me. I happily accepted the juice and sipped the liquid. Still, I could have sworn that I saw something. But maybe it was because the house was new and I was still getting used to it. We sat on the bed and chatted about a few things before the topic came back to the house. What do you think of the house? She fidgeted on the spot. I like it. This room is really creepy though. Are you sure you're gonna sleep in here? In all honesty, after the shadow person in the corner, I didn't want to. Not that I was going to tell her that. Yeah, it's a nice room. Look at how big it is. Was all she said. Normally she hung around a lot, but now it was strange for her. There were so many times when I had to tell her to leave me alone to give me some space. It was as though she didn't want to be here. She went up the stairs and I was left alone in the room. The basement door was closed. And I felt so alone down here. And normally, I like being alone. This was a completely different feeling. The day had turned to night. I had a nagging feeling that I was being watched. I also didn't want to leave my room. I had a weird dream, a nightmare. I can't remember it. Every night I become more and more tired. I didn't want to leave my bed. I stopped spending time with my family and friends. In about a month, I stopped doing everything that I normally love. I stopped socializing, and I would get so angry if anyone disturbed me. I didn't want to go out. I needed to get some water and walked up the stairs. My hand tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. I struck the door several times to get whoever locked the door to let me out. I kept hitting it. It wouldn't budge. I felt a shiver run up my spine. Someone was standing behind me. I turned to look, and a small child stood behind me. It looked nearly identical to my sister. She was so still, expressionless. The room was so cold. I shook my head and fiddled with the doorknob again. Stay forever, it whispered to me. Stay. I kept hitting the door. Where the hell was everybody? The door opened. My mum looked at me confused and asked why I'd been banging on the door. I told her there was a ghost down there, a little girl, and that I didn't want to go down there again. She scoffed and rolled her eyes. My family never really believed in anything paranormal like this, and neither did I until it happened to me. I eventually moved out of the basement. I missed having my own personal space and all that extra room. And now, I share a room with my little sister, and while she annoys me, I have more energy again, and I'm happier and socializing once more. I'm happy I don't spend all that time with the creepy little ghost. Every so often, when I'm sent down there to get something from the basement, I swear I can see the shadows move. And I can always hear, stay with me. Fortunately, I think she's trapped in the basement. Why do basements always contain such really weird things?
Hello? My name is Kara, and if you're hearing this, I need your help. I was cleaning out my attic when I came across an old cassette tape. Thinking it was just some high school kid's mixtape, I popped it into my mom's old tape player to see what cringeworthy songs may be on it. Had I only known what it really was, I would have thrown it into the fireplace without a second thought. And oh, how I wish I would have. Instead of being greeted with the familiar sounds of MMMBop or one of the various jock jams, the tape simply contained the voice of a young girl. She explained that she had stumbled upon something otherworldly and was now caught in a dimension somewhere between life and death. She could see and hear all of her loved ones, but had no way to interact with them. The only thing that responded to her touch was an old tape recorder, so she made the tape in hopes that someone on the outside could help her. I did all the research I could, but my time has run out. Sadly, I must pass this message on to you in hopes that you can find the answers I couldn't. There's just one more thing. You now have 4 days to hopefully find the answers I couldn't, or I will take your place and you will take mine. I'm sorry I deceived you, but I had no other choice. Since I could not find the answers in time, I have become the girl on the tape, and I had no other option but to pass it on. For your sake, I hope you can find the answers I couldn't.
Okay, so this happened earlier tonight, and I know it's not very extreme, but I'm quite freaked out, and I really just want to get this out of my system. So, here we go. So, I'm a fairly small human with a very large dog. I'm about 5'1", female, and pretty skinny, and my dog is an Akita, around 100 pounds, and probably stronger than me if she ever actually tried. We go for walks twice a day, every day, for about 3 miles each, and one of these is at night. We live in the middle of a metropolitan area, so there's a lot of hotels, stores, and restaurants all over the place, and there is always people out and about. I've never felt unsafe walking around our area with my large dog, especially since with all these businesses comes regularly patrolling police cars and several private security agencies all around. We've lived here for nearly 3 years, walking every day and night without a single problem. On to tonight. We left for a normal walk, and while the streets are far less crowded, there are still some people out. We were about a mile from our apartment building when I walked past a man standing next to a convenience store in a dark gray hoodie. A lot of the homeless population around here sit outside of the convenience stores regularly, so I didn't initially think anything of it. We stepped to the edge of the sidewalk so that we would be about 6 feet away and intended to just walk past, but the man started to follow us and talk to me. He asked me about my dog at first. This is a very common question for us because she's not a well-known breed, and she is very beautiful, if somewhat intimidating animal. Unfortunately, in this instance, intimidating doesn't translate to aggressive. I answered that she is an Akita and continued to walk, keeping a good amount of distance between myself and the man, whom I will now call CG. CG starts asking why I'm walking away from him and specifically says that that's rude because we're old friends. I looked at him to make sure I wasn't wrong and said loudly, "No, I don't know you." I start walking faster and cross the street because I could see police lights flashing not far up the street. Sometimes the patrol cars will leave their lights on when there is no one in them. I'm not sure why, but that was the case here. I walked much more quickly towards the light, with CG following me, telling me I'm being mean and calling me Ashley over and over. To be clear, my name is not Ashley. While there was no security guard in the car, there were a few other people around. So I turned around and yelled again, "I don't know you, leave me alone." CG stopped walking towards me, but I heard him mumble something else about whoever Ashley is. At this point, I really just wanted to get home as quickly as possible, because I was a little bit panicked. This man was much taller than me, and fairly large, at least compared to me. So it made me very nervous that he had been following me. I decided to take an indirect route home that would take me away from the street I was currently on that CG had been sitting on originally. I was a few more blocks away down a different street when I saw him again. I had been keeping an eye out behind me to see if he followed, but no, he had crossed the street and was in front of me. I don't know if he had been hoping I wouldn't notice and would walk up to him or what. I think that must be it because CG had put a bandana over his face and had pulled up the hood, but I recognized the jacket in the frame and it was for sure the same guy. To get home, I would have to cross the street and walk right towards him. Instead, I crossed the street parallel to where he was, and he did as well. Then continued to walk towards me and started shouting, calling me Ashley again. I didn't hear a lot of what he said, but I turned and ran with my dog in the other direction. About a block away was a hotel, so I walked into the lobby and right up to the front desk. The front desk worker could tell something was wrong because I was clearly just trying not to cry. I apologized for bringing my dog in, but said that someone had been following me, and I wanted to know if I could wait here and call the police. The worker was very kind and walked me to the glass door and asked me which man it was. I couldn't see him anymore in the direction from which I had come, so for a moment I thought CG had left, but no, he was at the other end of the parking entrance, hood down now, but standing against the wall, as if he was just waiting. The worker said I could wait as long as I needed, and he called the police from the hotel phone. I think they had the non-emergency line written down, and since he hadn't technically done anything but yell and follow me around for a while, I agreed that the non-emergency line was probably the right choice. A cruiser showed up fairly soon though, and I pointed out CG to the cops who was still just waiting there against the wall. Technically, I couldn't prove he'd done anything illegal, but the cops went and told him that he needed to leave the property as he was trespassing. They waited for him to leave and then gave me and my dog a ride back to my apartment building to make sure he didn't continue to follow us and find out where we lived. I don't know who CG or who Ashley is, but let's not meet. And I hope Ashley doesn't meet him either.